Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The emergency light's crimson pulse painted the basement walls in intervals of blood and shadow, each flash accompanied by something that shouldn't exist. The distant echo of children's laughter drifting up from the renovated community center's depths. I'd been hired to watch this place for 3 weeks now, and every night brought the same unsettling ritual. The light would flicker, and somewhere in the maze of scaffolding below, invisible children would giggle. At least that's what I told myself they were. Invisible children. The alternative explanations felt far worse. The community center had been built in 1962, a squat brick monument to post-war optimism that had served the neighborhood for 40 years before budget cuts shuttered it permanently. Now, some nonprofit with deep pockets was breathing life back into the old building, and they needed someone to keep the copper thieves and vagrants away while the contractors weren't around. The pay was decent enough for what seemed like easy work. Sit in a folding chair, walk the perimeter every hour, make sure nobody stole anything that wasn't nailed down. They'd warned me about the emergency lighting system being temperamental. Old wiring, they said. Sometimes the backup power kicked in for no reason, especially in the basement where they were retrofitting the electrical. What they hadn't mentioned was the laughter. I descended the narrow stairs for my first basement check of the night, my flashlight cutting through the dusty air like a sword through smoke. The scaffolding created a labyrinth of metal tubes and wooden planks, casting irregular shadows that seemed to shift and breathe in my peripheral vision. My footsteps echoed off the concrete floor with a hollow persistence that made every movement feel significant, observed. The emergency light was mounted near the far wall, its red housing cracked and weathered. As I approached, it flickered once. A brief, electric spasm, and the basement filled with the sound of children at play. Not screaming or crying, but laughing with the uninhibited joy that only comes from pure, innocent delight. The sound seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the walls and scaffolding in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint a source. I stood perfectly still, my breathing shallow, waiting for the laughter to fade. It always did, usually within 30 seconds of the light's flash. But tonight, as the red glow stuttered again, the laughter swelled, growing louder and more complex. Not just one voice, but several, overlapping in harmonies that raised the hair on my neck. My radio crackled to life, startling me so violently that I nearly dropped my flashlight. The security company's dispatcher was doing his hourly check-in, his voice distorted by static. Unit 7, status report. I pressed the talk button with a thumb that felt disconnected from my hand. All clear. Just doing the basement walkthrough. Copy that. Everything normal down there? I glanced around the empty space, scaffolding casting skeletal shadows in every direction. The laughter had stopped the moment the radio activated, leaving only the building's natural sounds, the settling of old wood, the distant hum of HVAC equipment, the subtle whisper of air moving through the vents. Yeah, I said. Normal. But normal was becoming a relative term. I finished my circuit of the basement and climbed back to the main floor, where I'd set up my station near the front entrance. The folding chair faced a card table that held my thermos of coffee, a paperback novel, and a small television I'd brought to help pass the long hours. The building felt different tonight, heavier somehow, as if the air itself had gained weight and substance. Around midnight, I decided to explore areas I hadn't thoroughly investigated yet. The building was larger than it appeared from outside, with a warren of small rooms branching off the main halls. Former offices, storage spaces, a kitchen that still smelled faintly of industrial disinfectant, and decades of institutional meals. Most were empty now, stripped of furniture and fixtures, waiting for whatever renovation would transform them next. It was in one of these rooms, tucked away at the end of a corridor I'd never fully explored, that I found the projector. The room couldn't have been more than 10 feet square, with pale green walls that had probably been cheerful once but now looked sickly under my flashlight beam. In the center of the space sat an old Bell & Howell 8mm projector, the kind that belonged in a suburban den circa 1975. It hummed with quiet mechanical purpose, its reels turning steadily, feeding film through the gate and casting a bright rectangle of light onto the opposite wall. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this scene. The projector should have been silent and dark. There was no power outlet nearby, no extension cord snaking across the floor. Yet it ran with perfect consistency, its mechanical heartbeat steady and hypnotic. The image on the wall showed the community center's basement in grainy, washed-out color. I recognized the scaffolding arrangement, the positioning of the emergency light, even the crack in the concrete floor where water damage had left a permanent stain. But this wasn't a recording. It was happening now. As I watched, a figure moved through the frame, and I realized with a chill that traced my spine like ice water that I was watching myself from 20 minutes ago, during my first basement inspection. The film showed my descent down the stairs, my cautious navigation through the scaffolding, my approach to the emergency light. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, down to the way I'd paused to examine a particularly elaborate joint in the scaffold construction. But there was an addition that made my throat constrict. Behind my filmed self, maybe 15 feet back and partially obscured by shadows, something crouched between two vertical support beams. It was human-shaped but wrong in ways my mind struggled to catalog. Too angular in some places, too fluid in others, like a person seen through water or heat distortion. The figure remained perfectly still while my recorded self moved through the basement, never approaching, but always maintaining that same distance, that same watchful crouch. The film reel clicked as it reached its end, and for a moment, the wall showed only bright white light. Then the mechanism engaged with a soft mechanical sigh, and the footage began again. Same basement, same journey, same impossible shadow following behind me. I backed away from the projector until my shoulders hit the wall. The logical part of my mind cycled through explanations. Pre-recorded footage, trick photography, some elaborate prank orchestrated by the renovation crew. But none of these explanations addressed the fundamental impossibility of what I was seeing. Film of events that had happened less than an hour ago, captured by equipment that couldn't possibly have been in the basement with me. The radio on my belt squawked again. This time, the dispatcher's voice sounded distant and hollow, as if transmitted through water. Unit 7, we're showing some irregularities in your patrol pattern. Everything okay? I fumbled for the radio, my hands shaking badly enough that I nearly dropped it. I'm fine, just investigating something. Copy. Maintain standard patrol intervals. The transmission ended with a burst of static that sounded almost like laughter. Not the innocent giggling from the basement, but something older and more knowing. I forced myself to look at the projector again. The film was still running, still showing my basement exploration, still featuring that crouched figure that somehow managed to remain just outside my peripheral vision, even though I was watching it directly. But now there was something new. The figure's head had turned slightly, and I could see the suggestion of a face. Not features exactly, but the impression of eyes that reflected the emergency light's red glow. Every rational thought in my head told me to leave. Walk out of this room, out of this building, get in my car, and drive until the sun came up. But I couldn't move. The film held me transfixed, each repetition revealing new details I'd missed before. The way the figure's shadow fell at an angle that defied the basement's lighting. The way its outline seemed to shimmer and shift between frames. The way it appeared to be watching not just my recorded self, but somehow looking directly at me through the projector's lens. I finally managed to tear my gaze away and stumble toward the door, but stopped when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Slow, deliberate steps that matched the rhythm of someone being very careful not to be heard. The sound grew closer, then paused directly outside the room where I stood frozen. The footsteps resumed, moving away down the corridor, and I realized they were heading toward the basement stairs. I crept to the doorway and peered out. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, illuminated by a few scattered emergency lights that created pools of red radiance in the darkness. But as I watched, one of those lights began to flicker with the same irregular pattern I'd noticed in the basement, and somewhere below me, children's laughter began to echo up through the building's bones. The film projector continued its mechanical whisper behind me, casting its impossible footage onto walls that suddenly felt far too close. I stepped into the hallway, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name toward the basement stairs. Each step felt like walking through thick honey, my movements slow and deliberate despite the growing urgency in my chest. At the top of the stairs, I paused. The laughter had grown more complex, more layered, as if dozens of invisible children were playing some elaborate game in the darkness below. The emergency light's flicker painted the walls in stuttering crimson, creating the illusion that the scaffolding was moving, shifting, rearranging itself between each flash. I began my descent, one hand trailing along the concrete wall for balance, the other gripping my flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached. The beam swept back and forth across the basement floor, revealing nothing but shadows and metal and the accumulated dust of renovation work. But I could feel eyes on me, not watching exactly, but waiting, evaluating, measuring. Halfway down the stairs, I stopped. There, in the exact spot where the film had shown that crouched figure, something waited between the scaffolding supports, not moving, not breathing, just existing in a way that made the air around it feel thicker, heavier. My flashlight beam passed over it without revealing any clear details, just the suggestion of a human shape, angular and wrong, exactly as I'd seen in the projection. The laughter stopped abruptly, as if someone had thrown a switch. The sudden silence was worse than the sound had been, a complete absence that seemed to pull at my eardrums and make my heart skip beats. The emergency light flickered one final time, casting everything in that familiar red glow, and in that brief illumination, I saw the figure clearly. It was crouched exactly as the film had shown, but now its head was turned toward me, and where a face should have been, there was only smooth darkness punctuated by 2 points of reflected light. Not eyes exactly, but something that served the same function. Something that had been watching me for weeks, maybe longer, waiting for this moment when I would finally see it as clearly as it had always seen me. The light died, plunging the basement into complete darkness. In the black silence that followed, I heard the soft scrape of movement, not footsteps, but something sliding across the concrete floor with patient, inexorable purpose. Getting closer. My radio crackled one final time, the dispatcher's voice now barely recognizable through layers of static. Unit 7, position, do you copy? I tried to respond, tried to call for help, but my throat had closed completely. The sliding sound grew closer, accompanied now by something else. A mechanical clicking that I slowly realized was identical to the sound of film advancing through a projector gate. Frame by frame, moment by moment. Reality flickering between existence and void in precise measured intervals. The emergency light's housing creaked somewhere in the darkness above me, a sound like old bones settling. In that creak, I thought I heard laughter again. Not children this time, but something older and infinitely more patient. Something that had been waiting in this basement for a very long time, documenting and cataloging and preparing for this exact moment when the film would finally match the reality, when the watcher would finally meet the watched. I raised my flashlight with hands that no longer felt entirely under my control, knowing that whatever I illuminated in the next few seconds would change everything I thought I understood about the nature of observation, documentation, and the terrible persistence of things that exist just outside the frame of normal perception. The beam cut through the darkness, and there was nothing there. Just scaffolding and shadows and the accumulated dust of renovations that might never be completed. The basement was empty, silent, normal in every conceivable way. But as I stood there, breathing hard and questioning everything I thought I'd experienced, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. There, in the dust at my feet, was a perfect trail of disturbance. Not footprints exactly, but the clear evidence of something having moved across the floor in a straight line from the scaffolding to where I now stood. The trail ended directly beneath my feet, as if whatever had made it had simply merged with my position. I looked up toward the emergency light, and it winked once. A brief, knowing flash that painted everything red, for just long enough to see my own shadow stretched across the wall behind me. But the shadow was wrong. It showed not one figure but two. Myself, and something crouched directly behind me, so close that I should have been able to feel its breath on my neck. I spun around, but found only empty air, and the settling darkness of a basement that might have been perfectly normal, or might have been something else entirely. The distinction no longer seemed particularly important. Somewhere above me, film continued to run through an impossible projector, documenting moments that existed in the space between reality and memory, between observation and experience. And I understood, with the kind of certainty that bypasses rational thought entirely, that I would never again be able to move through any space without wondering what might be crouched just outside my peripheral vision, waiting patiently for the moment when the film would finally catch up to the truth. The emergency light flickered one last time, and in the darkness that followed, I thought I heard the soft mechanical whisper of a projector somewhere very close, documenting this moment for an audience I would never see but could no longer deny was always watching. Story 2. The Hillcrest Sanatorium had been sealed for 37 years, but the air inside still tasted of antiseptic and desperation. I adjusted the shoulder strap of my equipment bag and pressed my palm against the cold metal of the DAT recorder, feeling its familiar weight like a talisman against the oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. Professor Henley's auditory archaeology project sounded ridiculous when he'd first pitched it to our graduate program. The idea that abandoned buildings retained acoustic impressions of their past, echoes waiting to be captured by sensitive equipment. But the grant money was real enough, and I needed the research credits. Now, standing in the main corridor with dust motes dancing in shafts of amber light filtering through boarded windows, the concept didn't seem quite so absurd. The hallway stretched ahead of me like a throat, lined with doorways that gaped open into darkness. My footsteps echoed despite my attempts to walk quietly, the sound bouncing off water-stained walls and cracked linoleum. The building's silence wasn't peaceful. It was hungry, expectant, as if it had been waiting decades for someone to finally listen. I pulled out my field notebook and sketched the layout, noting the temperature readings and ambient sound levels. The DAT recorder's LED display showed perfect capture quality, its sensitive microphone picking up every whisper of settling wood and distant water drip. According to the building plans, this floor had housed the long-term psychiatric patients. Their rooms were smaller than the medical wards below, with reinforced doors and narrow windows set too high to reach. The first room I entered had been stripped bare except for an iron bed frame bolted to the floor, paint peeled from the walls in long strips, revealing layers of institutional green beneath institutional white. I positioned the microphone toward the corner where shadows gathered thickest and pressed record. Static filled my headphones for the first few minutes, the natural white noise of old buildings breathing. But then, barely audible beneath the electronic hiss, I heard something else. A voice, so faint it might have been my imagination, whispered words I couldn't quite make out. I rewound the recording and played it back, adjusting the gain. The voice was clearer now, raspy and strained, speaking in a rhythm I recognized but couldn't place. The words themselves remained unclear, dissolving into static whenever I tried to focus on them. I made notes about the anomaly and moved to the next room. The pattern repeated itself. Silence, then static, then that hoarse whisper threading through the electronic noise like smoke through water. By the fourth room, I was certain the voice was consistent, speaking in the same measured cadence each time. I increased the recording sensitivity and held my breath, straining to understand what it was saying. Tuesday, October 15th. Couldn't sleep again last night. The dreams are getting worse, more vivid. I keep seeing the old house on Maple Street, the one with the green shutters. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Those were my words. From my personal journal, the one I kept locked in the glove compartment of my car parked outside the sanatorium gates. I'd written that exact entry 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday when insomnia had driven me to document the recurring nightmares that had been plaguing me since childhood. I jerked the headphones off, my heart hammering against my ribs. The recording was still running. The microphone pointed at empty air in a room that had been vacant for decades. I checked the playback again, and there it was. My journal entry, spoken in a voice that sounded like mine but damaged, as if the words had been pulled through broken glass. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I'd been mumbling while recording, unconsciously reciting entries I'd memorized through repetition. But I knew that wasn't true. I'd never read that particular entry aloud, had barely thought about it since writing it. And the voice, it was mine, but wrong somehow, older and more weathered than it should have been. I stumbled into the hallway, my equipment bag bouncing against my hip. The sanatorium felt different now, less empty and more watchful. The shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and every sound I made was answered by an echo that took just a fraction too long to return. My hand shook as I pulled out my cell phone to call Professor Henley, but the signal bars showed empty. The building's metal framework and thick walls created a dead zone, cutting me off from the outside world. I was alone with whatever force was speaking my most private thoughts back to me through decades-old silence. The next room yielded another entry. Wednesday, October 16th. Met with Dr. Morrison about the anxiety attacks. He wants to increase the dosage, but I'm worried about the side effects. Feel like I'm losing pieces of myself. That entry described my session with the campus counselor, a conversation I'd never shared with anyone. The details were perfect, down to his suggestion about medication and my hesitation about the potential cognitive effects. Hearing it spoken in that damaged version of my voice made me feel violated, as if someone had been reading over my shoulder while I wrote in the supposed privacy of my apartment. I needed to see the journal, to confirm that these entries actually existed and weren't somehow false memories the building was implanting in my mind. The thought sounded insane, but so did everything else about my situation. I packed up my equipment and headed for the exit, my footsteps echoing down the corridor like gunshots. The October air outside tasted clean and sharp after the sanatorium's stale atmosphere. My car sat in the gravel parking lot exactly where I'd left it, unremarkable and solid and real. I fumbled with my keys, cursing under my breath as they slipped through my sweating fingers. The glove compartment opened with a familiar click, revealing the small leather journal I'd kept since graduate school started. I flipped through pages filled with my careful handwriting, searching for the October entries the voice had recited. But the pages were blank, not empty, but actually blank, as if the ink had been erased or simply vanished. I stared at the empty pages, my mind reeling. I could see faint impressions where my pen had pressed into the paper, the ghost traces of words that were no longer there. The dates were still visible at the top of each page, written in a different pen than the vanished text, but everything else had disappeared. A sound from inside the sanatorium made me look up. Through one of the upper windows, I could see a faint green glow, like phosphorescent paint activated by darkness. As I watched, the glow moved across the window and vanished, only to reappear in the next window over. It was following the path I'd taken through the building, tracing my route from room to room. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I found myself walking back toward the entrance. The journal felt warm in my hand, as if the missing words were trying to burn their way back onto the pages. I had to know what was happening, had to understand why my most private thoughts were echoing through an abandoned building. The green glow was stronger inside, emanating from the walls themselves in patterns that looked almost like writing. As I climbed the stairs to the psychiatric ward, the patterns became clearer. Words were appearing on the water-stained plaster, written in what looked like mold or fungus growing in real time. Thursday, October 17th, the wall read in luminescent script. Can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me. Even in my apartment, even with the doors locked, I feel eyes on me constantly. It's making me paranoid, making me question everything. That entry had been one of my most personal, written during a panic attack when the weight of graduate school and research had been crushing down on me. I'd described the sensation of being observed, the way my skin crawled even when I was alone. Now, standing in a building where that sensation was magnified tenfold, I understood that the feeling had never really left me. More text bloomed across the walls as I moved deeper into the ward, each entry more intimate than the last. The building was reading my journal back to me, but not from the physical book. It was pulling the words directly from my memory, from the act of writing them. Somehow, the sanatorium had become connected to my thoughts, tapping into the stream of consciousness I'd been recording for months. The DAT recorder was still running, capturing everything. When I played back the last few minutes, I could hear my own breathing, my footsteps, and underneath it all, that raspy whisper speaking words that were appearing on the walls around me. The voice was getting clearer, more distinct, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just reading my journal entries. It was learning my voice, becoming more like me with each word it spoke. In the final room, the one where I'd first heard the voice, the walls were covered in glowing text. But these weren't entries from my journal. These were thoughts I'd never written down, fears I'd never articulated even to myself. The building was reading deeper now, accessing parts of my mind I'd kept locked away. You came here looking for echoes. The text pulsed on the wall directly in front of me. But you've become the echo. This place remembers everyone who's ever been trapped inside it, everyone who's ever felt the walls closing in. We've been waiting so long for someone who would listen, someone who would understand what it's like to be recorded, preserved, replayed endlessly. The DAT recorder in my hand grew warm, its display flickering with patterns that matched the text on the walls. I realized that I'd been recording more than just ambient sound. I'd been capturing something else, something that had been waiting in the silence for decades. The machine had become a conduit, allowing whatever haunted this place to speak through the only voice it could access. Mine. The journal in my other hand began to grow heavy, its blank pages fluttering as if stirred by an invisible wind. When I looked down, I saw new text appearing. But it wasn't my handwriting. The words were being written in the same luminescent script that covered the walls, burning themselves into the paper with a light that hurt to look at directly. "Welcome home," the journal wrote itself. "You're going to stay, aren't you? You understand now that some silences are meant to be broken, some voices are meant to be heard. The experiment was never about listening to the past. It was about adding your voice to the chorus." I backed toward the door, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The recording equipment weighed me down like anchors, and I realized that I'd become part of whatever force inhabited this place. My voice, captured and stored in the DAT recorder, was already being woven into the building's memory. Every word I'd spoken, every breath I'd taken while inside these walls, had been absorbed and cataloged. The green glow pulsed brighter, and I heard my own voice whisper from speakers that didn't exist, telling stories I'd never lived, describing experiences that belonged to the countless patients who'd lived and suffered in these rooms. I was becoming a vessel for their voices, just as they'd become vessels for mine. The journal continued writing itself as I watched, filling page after page with entries I'd never made, thoughts I'd never thought, fears that belonged to people who died before I was born. But mixed in with the foreign text were fragments of my own writing, my own thoughts, twisted and reflected back at me through the building's distorted memory. I don't know how long I stood there, watching my identity dissolve into the collective voice of the sanatorium. Time moved differently inside those walls, measured not in minutes or hours, but in the accumulation of recorded thoughts and captured whispers. The DAT recorder's battery should have died hours ago, but it kept running, powered by something that didn't follow the normal rules of electricity or physics. When I finally found the strength to move, to stumble toward the exit, I carried with me more than just my equipment. The building had branded itself onto my consciousness, leaving traces of every voice it had ever captured. I could feel them in my mind like half-remembered songs, whispering their stories in languages I didn't speak but somehow understood. The journal came with me, its pages now full of text that shifted and changed when I wasn't looking directly at it. Some entries were mine, some belonged to others, and some seemed to be writing themselves in real time, documenting thoughts I was having before I'd fully formed them. The line between my voice and the voices of the sanatorium had been permanently blurred. Outside, my car waited in the parking lot, unchanged and ordinary, But when I looked back at the building, I could see my own face in one of the upper windows, mouth moving as if speaking words I couldn't hear. The figure waved at me, and I felt my own hand rise in response, though I hadn't consciously decided to wave back. I drove away from Hillcrest Sanatorium with the DAT recorder still running, still capturing the silence that was no longer silent. The voice that had started as a whisper now spoke clearly through the car's speakers, reading entries from the journal that continued to write itself on the passenger seat. Sometimes it was my voice, sometimes it belonged to others, and sometimes it was a chorus of voices speaking in perfect unison. Professor Henley's auditory archaeology project had been a success, but not in the way he'd intended. I'd found proof that buildings do retain acoustic impressions of their past, but I'd also learned that some impressions are infectious, spreading from structure to person to recording device like a virus of memory and voice. The journal finished writing its final entry as I pulled into my apartment complex. In my own handwriting, but in words I'd never chosen, it read, "The experiment continues. The silence has found a new home, a new voice to carry its message. Soon, others will listen. Soon, the chorus will grow." I carried my equipment upstairs, knowing that I would transcribe the recordings, knowing that I would share them with Professor Henley and the rest of the research team. The voice that was mine but not mine whispered encouragement as I worked, praising my dedication to the project, celebrating the success of our collaboration. In the weeks that followed, other graduate students would visit Hillcrest Sanatorium with their own recording equipment. They would hear voices speaking their private thoughts, see their own words appearing on moldy walls, feel the building learning their voices and adding them to its collection. The auditory archaeology project would expand, documenting not just the echoes of the past, but creating new echoes for the future. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in the space where my own voice used to live alone, a chorus of whispers continues to grow, each one grateful for the chance to speak again, each one hungry for new voices to join the eternal conversation that flows through the silence like blood through veins. The DAT recorder sits on my desk now, its red light still blinking, still capturing the sounds that surround me. Sometimes, late at night when the apartment is quiet, I hear it playing back conversations I don't remember having, thoughts I don't remember thinking, spoken in voices that sound like mine but older, more weathered, as if they've been speaking in the dark for 37 years. I've learned to listen to the silence. I've learned that some echoes are more than just reflected sound. They're invitations, opportunities, chances to become part of something larger than yourself. The journal continues to write itself, documenting the thoughts of everyone who's ever felt truly alone, everyone who's ever needed someone to listen to the voices in their head. The experiment was never about the building. It was about us. Story 3. The abandoned St. Catherine's Hospital had been calling to us for months, its skeletal frame rising against the December sky like a monument to forgotten suffering. The building had been empty for 15 years, but something about its broken windows and rust-stained concrete demanded exploration. Our parkour crew, Marcus, Jenna, Kyle, and myself, had conquered dozens of urban ruins, but this place felt different from the moment we cut through the perimeter fence. The main lobby still reeked of antiseptic and decay, a chemical ghost that clung to the peeling wallpaper and warped linoleum. Fluorescent fixtures hung at odd angles, their tubes shattered and scattered across the floor like broken bones. The silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight, broken only by the distant drip of water somewhere in the building's depths. Marcus had mapped our route the previous week, through the lobby, up the central stairwell to the third floor, then a series of precision jumps across the skeletal remains of what had once been the children's ward. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. A place once dedicated to healing now served as our playground, its deterioration transformed into obstacles and challenges. The first 2 floors passed without incident. My muscles found their rhythm quickly, the familiar burn of exertion washing away the strange unease that had settled over me since we'd entered. Jenna moved with her usual cat-like grace, Kyle attacked each obstacle with brute force, and Marcus documented everything with his helmet cam, already planning our next YouTube upload. It was on the approach to the third floor that things began to change. The stairwell's metal handrail felt wrong beneath my palm, not just cold, but actively drawing heat from my skin. At first, I attributed it to the building's lack of heating and the December chill seeping through broken windows. But as we climbed higher, the metal grew progressively colder, until touching it became genuinely uncomfortable. That's when I noticed the condensation. Tiny droplets of water had begun forming along the rail's surface, beating and rolling downward in perfect measured intervals. The phenomenon made no sense. The air was dry, almost brittle, and certainly not humid enough to cause such pronounced condensation. Yet the water continued to appear, each drop perfectly spherical and impossibly cold. Kyle mentioned it first, shaking his hand after gripping the rail. The others acknowledged the strangeness but pressed on. We'd encountered weird atmospheric conditions in abandoned buildings before. Old heating systems, trapped moisture, temperature differentials between floors. There were always explanations. But as we reached the third floor landing, the droplets falling from the handrail began to take on patterns. I stopped first, crouching beside a small puddle that had formed near the stairwell door. The water wasn't spreading randomly across the cracked tile floor. Instead, it seemed to be following deliberate paths, creating shapes that looked almost intentional. The others gathered around, their breathing visible in the suddenly frigid air. Jenna pointed out what we all saw but hesitated to acknowledge. The water was forming symbols, not random splashes or natural flow patterns, but deliberate markings that resembled ancient script or runes. Marcus suggested we document everything before moving on, but as he reached for his phone, the water droplets began falling faster. The condensation along the handrail had become a steady stream, and each drop that struck the floor added to the growing array of symbols. The patterns were becoming more complex, interconnected, almost like a language we couldn't read, but somehow understood conveyed something urgent. That's when Kyle suggested we leave. The practical part of my mind agreed immediately. We'd explored dozens of abandoned buildings, and we all knew the first rule. When something feels wrong, trust that instinct. But as the others began gathering their gear, I found myself drawn to one of the larger puddles near the stairwell's base. My reflection stared back at me from the dark water, but something was off about it. The image seemed slightly ahead of my movements, as if it were predicting rather than mirroring my actions. I tilted my head to the left, and my reflection completed the motion a fraction of a second before I did. The others were already heading back toward the second floor, their voices echoing in the stairwell as they discussed the strange condensation and agreed it was time to find a different route, or abandon the session entirely. I should have followed them. Every rational thought in my head screamed at me to leave with my team, to get out of the building and never look back. Instead, I found myself leaning closer to the puddle. My reflection was definitely moving independently now, not just preceding my actions but performing entirely different movements. While I remained crouched and still, my reflection stood up, turned toward what would have been the third floor landing, and began walking. I felt a compulsion, not quite physical, but undeniably real, to mirror the reflection's movements. When I resisted, remaining frozen in my crouch, a nauseating sensation washed over me. The world seemed to tilt, my vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment, I felt as if I were falling despite being firmly planted on solid ground. The sensation intensified until I stood up, exactly as my reflection had done moments before. The relief was immediate and disturbing. As soon as I matched my reflection's position, the vertigo disappeared. The world righted itself, and I felt stable again. But now my reflection was moving again, walking deliberately toward the third floor landing, and I could feel that same compulsion building, the choice between following or falling into some kind of endless, nightmarish descent. My teammates' voices were growing fainter as they continued their retreat. I called out to them, but my voice sounded wrong in the stairwell, muffled and distant even to my own ears. They either couldn't hear me or were already too far away to respond clearly. The reflection's pace was measured, deliberate, giving me just enough time to follow without feeling rushed, but never enough time to consider alternatives. Each step I took to match its movements brought a wave of relief. but also a growing certainty that I was walking deeper into something I couldn't understand or control. The third-floor landing felt different than it had during our earlier reconnaissance. The air was thicker here, heavy with a presence that made my skin crawl. The broken windows that should have let in the gray December light seemed to filter the illumination strangely, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. More puddles had formed on this level, and in each one, my reflection continued its purposeful journey. The figure in the water moved with confidence, navigating obstacles and turns that I couldn't see in the real space around me. Yet every time I hesitated to follow, that terrible falling sensation returned, growing stronger and more disorienting. I began to understand the horrible logic of my situation. The reflection wasn't just showing me 5 seconds into the future, it was showing me the only path that didn't lead to that endless fall. Each movement was predetermined, each step necessary to avoid some kind of temporal or spatial trap that I couldn't fully comprehend. The children's ward stretched before me, a maze of collapsed walls and debris that we'd planned to navigate with careful precision jumps. But now, following my reflection's guidance, I found myself taking a completely different route. The figure in the puddles led me through passages that shouldn't have existed, around corners that didn't align with the building's architecture, past rooms whose doorways opened onto impossible spaces. Time became elastic. I couldn't tell if I'd been following the reflection for minutes or hours. My phone had no signal, and when I tried to check the time, the screen displayed meaningless symbols that hurt to look at directly. The cold was seeping into my bones, but I no longer felt entirely connected to my physical body. I was following, observing, trapped in a loop of movement that felt both voluntary and completely beyond my control. The reflection began leading me in circles, or what I thought were circles, until I realized that each loop was subtly different. We were spiraling inward, approaching something at the center of the ward that I couldn't see directly but could sense watching me. The runes on the floor had become more elaborate, forming interconnected patterns that seemed to pulse with their own internal logic. Other reflections began appearing in the puddles, not just my own, but figures I didn't recognize, all moving with the same purposeful determination. Some wore modern clothing, others seemed dressed from different eras entirely. All of them were following the same compulsive dance, matching the movements of their reflections to avoid the fall. I realized with growing horror that I wasn't the first person to become trapped in this loop. The building had been calling to urban explorers, parkour enthusiasts, anyone drawn to abandoned spaces for years. We were all here, all following our reflections through the same impossible choreography, all trying to avoid the same endless descent. The reflection finally stopped in what had once been a patient room, now nothing but bare walls and a single large puddle in the center. As I approached, I could see not just my own reflection, but dozens of others, all standing in the same position, all staring up at me with the same expression of dawning understanding. I knelt beside the puddle, and my reflection knelt as well. But this time, there was no 5-second delay. We moved in perfect synchronization, and for a moment, I felt the boundaries between myself and the figure in the water begin to blur. The reflection reached out its hand, and I found myself reaching down toward the water's surface. Our fingertips were about to touch when I heard voices echoing through the building. My teammates, calling my name, their flashlight beams cutting through the unnatural darkness of the ward. The spell, or whatever it was, wavered. I jerked my hand back from the water, and immediately felt that terrible falling sensation return with overwhelming force. But this time, instead of matching my reflection's movements, I chose to fall. The world tilted, spun, and I felt myself dropping through layers of reality that shouldn't have existed. But as I fell, I could hear my teammates getting closer, their voices growing stronger, more real than anything I'd experienced since entering the stairwell. I crashed back into normal awareness to find myself lying on the cold tile floor of the children's ward, Kyle and Marcus hauling me to my feet while Jenna checked for injuries. They told me I'd been missing for 20 minutes, that they'd searched the entire second floor before thinking to look for me up here. They found me standing motionless in the center of an empty room, staring down at a small puddle of stagnant water, completely unresponsive to their calls. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt wrong in my mouth. too inadequate to convey the reality of the experience. They attributed my disorientation to hypothermia or some kind of panic attack brought on by the building's oppressive atmosphere. We left immediately, and I didn't argue. But as we descended the stairwell, I caught glimpses of my reflection in the remaining puddles, and it was still moving 5 seconds ahead of me, still trying to lead me back to that room, back to the moment when our fingertips would touch and the boundaries would finally dissolve completely. I haven't returned to St. Catherine's Hospital, and I've quit urban exploration entirely, but sometimes, in mirrors, in windows, in any reflective surface when the light hits it just right, I catch sight of that other version of myself, still trapped in the loop, still following the choreography that keeps it from falling forever. And sometimes, on nights when the boundary between sleeping and waking grows thin, I feel that compulsion returning, the need to follow, to match the movements, to complete the dance I started in that abandoned children's ward. I wonder if the reflection is still waiting for me, standing patiently beside that puddle, hand outstretched, ready to pull me back into a reality where the only choice is between falling forever and surrendering completely to something that exists in the spaces between what is and what might be. The worst part is that I'm never entirely sure which side of the reflection I'm actually on. Story 4. The scanner's red dot swept across the warped plaster, like a bloody finger tracing secrets I wasn't meant to find. 3 weeks until demolition, and here I was in the bowels of Hartwell Hall, the most architecturally nightmarish building on campus, trying to digitally preserve what everyone else wanted to forget. The laser scanner hummed its mechanical lullaby as I adjusted the tripod for the 15th time that morning. My architecture professor had suggested this project as extra credit, map the building's labyrinthine interior before the wrecking ball arrived. What he hadn't mentioned was how the place seemed to exhale malevolence through its cracked walls, or how the fluorescent lights flickered in patterns that made my eyes water. I'd been working floor by floor for 2 weeks, and each scan revealed something that made me question my equipment. Corridors that stretched impossibly long in the digital model, rooms that appeared to have no doors, and most unsettling of all, spaces that my feet had walked through, but the scanner insisted didn't exist. The basement level was the worst. Standing here now, surrounded by yellowed linoleum and the persistent smell of something sweet and rotten, I could feel the building's weight pressing down like a held breath. The scanner beeped completion, and I packed it up with the same methodical care I'd used since day one, though my hands trembled slightly as I secured the tripod legs. Back in my cramped studio apartment, I uploaded the data and watched the point cloud materialize on my screen. The familiar knot formed in my stomach as I rotated the 3D model. The main corridor I'd just walked, where I'd set up the scanner 3 separate times to capture its full length, simply wasn't there. Instead, the scan showed a solid wall where the hallway should begin, as if I'd been walking through plaster and brick. I rubbed my eyes until phosphenes danced behind my lids. Equipment malfunction. Had to be. But the scanner was university grade, calibrated monthly, and I'd checked every setting twice. I'd even borrowed a backup unit last week with identical results. My phone buzzed. A text from my roommate asking if I'd be home for dinner. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m., but I'd started the scan at 10 a.m. I stared at the glowing numbers, certain they were wrong, but they didn't change. Somehow, 13 hours had passed in what felt like 3. Sleep came fitfully, populated by dreams of endless corridors that folded in on themselves like Mobius strips. I woke with the taste of dust in my mouth and a ringing headache that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. By morning, I'd convinced myself there was a logical explanation. Old buildings were notorious for electromagnetic interference. The wiring in Hartwell probably hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. That would explain the scanning errors, even the time loss. Maybe the display on my phone had glitched. I returned to the basement with grim determination and a new scanning strategy. This time, I'd map smaller sections, overlapping each scan to ensure complete coverage. The building seemed quieter today. the usual groaning of old pipes and settling foundations muted to barely audible whispers. I set up in the main corridor again, the one that didn't exist according to my data. The walls here were painted institutional green, a color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Decades of students had left their mark, carved initials, faded graffiti, the occasional phone number written in ballpoint pen. I ran my fingers along the plaster, feeling the accumulated grime and the subtle texture of paint layered over paint. The scan progressed normally until I reached what should have been the junction with the east wing. There, painted directly onto the wall in the same institutional green, was a door. Not a door frame, not a doorway that had been sealed, but a painted door, complete with a brass knob that gleamed as if recently polished. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing strangely in the narrow space. Some art student's prank, obviously. The trompe-l'oeil was expertly done. The shadows fell correctly, the perspective was perfect. Even the wood grain looked real enough to touch. So I did. The brass knob was warm under my palm and turned with a soft click that seemed to resonate through the building's skeleton. The painted door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing another corridor that stretched into darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. I stepped back, my rational mind cataloging impossibilities. The building's blueprints were burned into my memory from weeks of study. There was nothing behind that wall except the building's eastern foundation, but the corridor was undeniably there, and a current of air moved through it, carrying scents of old wood and something else, something organic and slightly sweet. My phone's flashlight beam penetrated maybe 20 feet before the darkness swallowed it completely. The walls inside were different, older wood paneling instead of painted plaster, and the floor was hardwood rather than linoleum. This was architecture from a different era, maybe even a different building entirely. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to close the painted door and pretend I'd never seen it. Instead, I stepped across the threshold. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. My breath misted in the beam of my flashlight, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of footsteps, not echoing, but muffled, as if someone was walking on carpet far ahead of me. The corridor stretched further than it should have, further than the building's footprint could possibly contain. I counted my steps. 50, 100, 200. At 300 steps, I stopped and turned around. Behind me, the painted door was a distant rectangle of green light, impossibly far away. My phone buzzed with a text notification, and I glanced at the screen out of habit. The time display read 12:00 a.m., not 12 midnight, 12 nothing, as if time had reset itself, started counting from zero the moment I'd crossed the threshold. The footsteps ahead of me had stopped. I called out, my voice smaller than I'd intended in the vast space. No response, but the silence felt different now, expectant, like the pause before a thunderclap. I aimed my flashlight down the corridor and saw them. More painted doors, dozens of them, lining both walls. Some were ajar, revealing glimpses of spaces that couldn't exist. A library with shelves that stretched up beyond sight. A classroom where the chalkboard writhed with equations that hurt to look at. A bathroom where the mirror showed no reflection at all. Behind one partially open door, I glimpsed what looked like my own dorm room, but wrong somehow. The furniture arranged differently, posters of bands I'd never heard of on the walls. Through another, I saw the architecture studio where I'd spent countless hours, but it was occupied by students I didn't recognize, all of them working in perfect silence on identical projects. I tried to photograph one of the doors with my phone, but the image that appeared on the screen showed only a blank wall. When I looked up from the device, the door I'd been photographing was closed, though I hadn't heard it move. The corridor began to curve, a gentle arc that shouldn't have been possible given the building's rectangular layout. With each step, the painted doors became more numerous, more elaborate. Some had brass nameplates with names I almost recognized. Professors who'd left the university years ago, students who'd graduated before I was born. Others bore symbols that seemed familiar but wrong, like half-remembered dreams. I came to a door marked with my own name. The brass plate was tarnished with age, as if it had been there for decades. Below my name, in smaller letters, was a date. Tomorrow's date, followed by the words, final scan. My hand moved toward the knob without conscious direction. The metal was ice cold, and when I turned it, the door opened onto a room I recognized and feared. It was this basement corridor, but seen from above, as if I were looking down through the ceiling. A figure stood in the hallway below, scanning the walls with a device I recognized as my laser scanner. The figure looked up suddenly, and I saw my own face staring back with an expression of dawning horror. I slammed the door and ran. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, but somehow I was back at the painted door almost immediately, bursting through into the familiar green hallway of Hartwell's basement. I spun around to close the door behind me, but there was only wall, institutional green plaster, unmarked by paint or portal. My phone showed the correct time now, though I couldn't remember what it had been before. The laser scanner sat where I'd left it, its display indicating a successful capture. But when I looked at the data later, the scan showed something impossible. The corridor I'd walked through was there in perfect detail, but it was marked as being 3 floors below the basement, in space that would have been solid Earth. I finished my project the next day, submitting a digital model that showed Hartwell Hall as a perfectly normal building with no architectural anomalies. My professor praised the work's accuracy and attention to detail. He made no mention of the impossible spaces the scanner had somehow captured, the corridors that couldn't exist. The building was demolished on schedule. I watched from across the quad as the wrecking ball reduced Hartwell Hall to rubble and dust. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working on other projects, I find myself scanning through the 3D model I created. In the basement level, if I know exactly where to look, I can still see the painted door. And if I enhance the point cloud resolution enough, I can make out the faint outlines of the corridor beyond. The corridor is always empty in the scans, but the data indicates that something was moving through it. Something that cast no shadow and reflected no laser light, but left traces in the electromagnetic noise of the scanner's sensors. Sometimes I think about loading up the model and following that corridor to its end, seeing what lies beyond the painted doors. But I never do, because deep down, I know that some spaces aren't meant to be mapped, and some doors aren't meant to be opened, even in dreams, especially in dreams. The strangest part isn't that I found something impossible in that basement. The strangest part is that according to every record I can find, Hartwell Hall was demolished 3 years before I started attending the university. The building I spent weeks scanning, the corridors I walked through, the painted door I opened, none of it should have existed. But I have the scans. I have the data. And sometimes when the campus is quiet and the light hits the quad just right, I can see the shadow of a building that isn't there anymore, and never was. Story 5. The water droplets had been falling for 3 days straight, each one hitting the concrete with a sound like chalk breaking against a blackboard. I'd been hired to fix the leaks beneath Jefferson High's gymnasium, a job that should have taken 2 hours maximum. Now, standing in the maintenance tunnels with my flashlight cutting through air thick enough to taste, I wondered if I'd ever find my way back to natural light. The first thing I noticed wasn't the dampness or the oppressive weight of the building above me. It was the smell, that distinctive blend of chalk dust and floor wax that every school carries in its bones. But down here, 30 feet below the gymnasium floor, it felt wrong. Invasive, like breathing in someone else's memories. I'd entered through the access hatch behind the building, following the maintenance supervisor's hastily drawn map. The tunnels formed a grid beneath the school, designed for easy access to plumbing and electrical systems. What the map hadn't shown were the additional passages, narrow corridors that branched off at odd angles, disappearing into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. The leak was supposed to be in section C4 according to the work order, but every emergency arrow I passed pointed in directions that made no sense, leading me deeper into the labyrinth of concrete and shadow. I'd been down here for 6 hours, and my sense of direction had abandoned me completely. That's when I first saw it happen. A drop of water fell from somewhere in the darkness above, landing on the smooth concrete floor with that familiar chalk snap sound. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, the splash formed perfect letters. Reverse. Then the water spread and dissolved, leaving only a dark stain that could have been anything. I stood there for several minutes, flashlight trained on the spot, waiting for another drop. When it came, landing 6 inches away, it formed nothing but an ordinary puddle. I told myself it was pareidolia, the mind's tendency to find patterns where none existed. But my hands had started shaking, and the chalk smell was getting stronger. The next arrow I found pointed left, down a corridor I could have sworn led right 10 minutes earlier. I followed it anyway, my footsteps echoing in ways that suggested vast empty spaces beyond the reach of my light. The walls seemed to absorb sound while simultaneously amplifying it, creating a disorienting effect that made me pause frequently to listen for what? I couldn't say. Another drop. Another moment of perfect lettering. Reverse. This time I was ready for it, watching the water hit the floor with scientific attention. There was no denying what I'd seen. The splash pattern defied basic physics, forming straight lines and curves that water simply couldn't make on its own. Yet within seconds, it was gone, leaving me to question my own eyes. I reached for my cell phone, thinking to call the supervisor, maybe get some clarification on the building's layout. No signal. Not surprising this far underground, but somehow more unsettling than it should have been. The phone's screen provided a weak blue glow that only made the surrounding darkness feel more absolute. The next emergency arrow pointed straight ahead, into a section of tunnel that felt different from the others. The air here was colder, and my breath came out in small clouds that the flashlight beam caught and scattered. The chalk smell was overwhelming now, mixed with something else. That particular mustiness of old books and forgotten classrooms. I'd gone maybe 50 feet when the first memory hit me. I was 8 years old, sitting in the back row of Mrs. Patterson's 3rd grade class, watching chalk dust dance in afternoon sunlight while she wrote multiplication tables on the blackboard. The detail was perfect. The way the chalk squeaked against the board, the mustiness of the textbooks, the feeling of being simultaneously bored and content. Except I'd never been in Mrs. Patterson's class. I'd never attended Jefferson High. I'd grown up 3 states away, in a town that had never had a building this old or tunnels this deep. The memory faded, leaving me standing in a concrete corridor that felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had moved inward while I wasn't paying attention. I pressed forward, following arrows that led me through turns I couldn't remember making, past intersections that hadn't been there moments before. More water drops. More perfect formations of that impossible word, reverse. I began timing them, counting the seconds between impacts. 37 seconds, 41, 29. No pattern, no rhythm I could predict or understand. But each one spelled out the same message with liquid precision before dissolving into ordinary water. The tunnel I was following began to slope downward more steeply. My ears popped twice, suggesting I was descending much deeper than any maintenance tunnel should go. The emergency lighting fixtures, which had been spaced every 20 feet, became more sporadic. Then they stopped altogether, leaving me dependent on my flashlight in absolute darkness. Another memory surfaced, this one sharper and more detailed than the first. I was 12, standing in Jefferson High's main hallway during some kind of assembly. The gymnasium doors were open, and I could see rows of folding chairs facing a small stage. A man in a brown suit was speaking about fire safety, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. I could feel the weight of my backpack, smell the cafeteria's tuna casserole mixing with floor wax and teenage sweat. But Jefferson High hadn't existed when I was 12. The building had been constructed 7 years ago, according to the plaque by the main entrance. I'd read it while waiting for the supervisor to meet me that morning. I stopped walking and pressed my back against the tunnel wall, trying to steady myself. The concrete was cold enough to penetrate my jacket, but somehow the contact was reassuring. Solid. Real. Unlike the memories that kept surfacing like bubbles in my mind. The next emergency arrow was different. Instead of the standard white lettering on green background, this one glowed with a faint phosphorescence that made my eyes water. It pointed left, toward a passage I hadn't noticed before. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the air coming from it carried scents that made my sinuses burn. Chalk dust so thick it formed clouds, floor wax heated to the point of producing visible fumes, and underneath it all, something organic and unsettling. I should have turned back then, should have retraced my steps, following my own footprints in the thin layer of dust that coated everything down here. But the memories were coming faster now, overlapping and contradicting each other, all of them centered on this building I'd never entered until today. I was 14, cutting class and hiding in the maintenance tunnels beneath the school. The pipes leaked constantly, and I'd learned to time the drops, to read patterns in their placement. Sometimes, if I watched carefully enough, the water would form words. I was 16, working as a janitor's assistant, mopping these same floors every night after everyone had gone home. The building held echoes of the day's activities, locker doors slamming, teachers calling for attention, the squeak of sneakers on gymnasium floors. But late at night, it held other sounds too. Footsteps in empty hallways, voices from rooms that should have been vacant. I was 19, graduating from Jefferson High despite having enrolled 3 years after the building was supposedly constructed, walking across a stage that existed before I was born, shaking hands with a principal whose name I couldn't remember but whose face was more familiar than my own reflection. Each memory felt absolutely authentic, complete with sensory details and emotional resonance. Yet they were impossible, contradictory, describing a history that couldn't exist. I found myself moving forward through the narrow passage without conscious decision, drawn by the phosphorescent arrow and the chalk-thick air. The passage opened into a circular chamber I hadn't seen on any schematic. The walls were lined with pipes that leaked constantly, creating a symphony of dropping water that echoed off curved concrete surfaces. And everywhere, on every available patch of floor, water drops spelled out that same word in perfect, impossible letters. Reverse, reverse, reverse. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all forming and dissolving in endless repetition. The sound was hypnotic, like being inside a massive clock whose mechanism was driven by falling water instead of gears. In the center of the chamber stood a maintenance ladder, leading upward into darkness so complete that my flashlight beam simply vanished. The rungs were old, pitted with rust and wear, but they looked solid enough. An emergency arrow pointed directly at the ladder, glowing with that same phosphorescent intensity. I climbed. The ladder rose farther than seemed possible, past pipes and electrical conduits that hummed with energy, past sections of wall that were sometimes concrete and sometimes brick, and sometimes materials I couldn't identify in the uncertain light. My arms burned with the effort, and several times I had to stop and rest, listening to the echo of dripping water from far below. When I finally reached the top, I found myself facing a simple wooden door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The lettering was fresh, but the wood looked ancient, warped with age and moisture. A thin line of light showed beneath the door, warm and yellow like incandescent bulbs. I opened it. I was standing in a classroom that couldn't exist. Rows of wooden desks faced a blackboard covered with multiplication tables written in chalk that seemed to glow with its own light. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in patterns too regular to be random. The air was thick with chalk dust and the particular silence of a school at the end of a long day. But I was underground, 30 feet below the gymnasium at least. There couldn't be windows here, couldn't be sunlight or wooden desks or blackboards covered with lessons from decades past. On the desk nearest to me lay a newspaper, folded to show the headline, "Jefferson High Construction Delayed Again." The date was impossibly old, from years before the building actually existed, but the paper looked fresh, the ink still sharp and black. I picked it up with hands that no longer felt like my own, and read the article beneath the headline. Construction delays due to unexpected underground caverns. Workers reporting strange acoustics in the foundation tunnels. Several instances of equipment malfunction, always involving water-based systems. The project supervisor quoted as saying the site seemed to resist development. The article continued on an inside page, but when I tried to turn to it, the paper crumbled in my hands like something that had been waiting decades for someone to touch it. That's when I heard the footsteps. Not from the tunnel I'd climbed through, but from somewhere else in the building. If building was the right word for whatever this place had become. Steady, measured steps moving through corridors that couldn't exist, getting closer to wherever I was. I moved to the window and looked out at a view that defied every law of physics and architecture I understood. Instead of the school parking lot or surrounding neighborhood, I saw Jefferson High as it had never been and always was. Under construction, half finished, surrounded by the kind of deep excavation that exposes bedrock and underground water systems. And in the excavation, I could see them clearly now. The tunnels. Miles of them, extending in every direction, forming a vast network beneath what would eventually become the school. But not random tunnels. Deliberate ones, carved with purpose, all leading to chambers like the one I'd just climbed from. The footsteps were closer now, just outside the classroom door. I understood then why every emergency arrow had led me in circles, why every drop of water spelled the same impossible word, why my memories belonged to someone else who had lived a life I'd never had in a building that shouldn't exist. The door opened, and I turned to face myself. He looked exactly as I did, down to the tool belt and flashlight, except his eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from searching these tunnels for much longer than 6 hours. Much longer than days or weeks or months. "You'll want to start climbing down now," he said, and his voice was mine but tired. So tired. "The water's been spelling it out for you the whole time. You just have to read it correctly." He was right, of course. I'd been reading the word wrong, seeing it from the wrong angle. When you're standing on a floor made of drops that spell REVERSE, and you reverse your perspective, when you see it from below instead of above, it spells something else entirely. Something that explained why I remembered attending a school that didn't exist when I was young. Why every emergency arrow led me deeper instead of out. Why the building seemed to know I was coming before I'd even accepted the job. I walked to the classroom door, past the other me who nodded as if he'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. The hallway beyond stretched in both directions, farther than any hallway should, lined with doors to classrooms that taught lessons I'd learned before I was born. The exit sign glowed green at the far end, exactly as it should. But I'd learned enough about emergency arrows down here to know that following them might not lead where you'd expect. I started walking anyway. Behind me, I could hear the steady drip of water hitting classroom floors, spelling out messages in a language I was finally beginning to understand. The chalk smell followed me as I walked, and with each step, I remembered a little more about my years at Jefferson High, about the friends I'd had, and the teachers who'd known my name, about the day I'd graduated, and the night I'd been hired to fix the leaks beneath the building I'd never really left. The exit door was heavy, older than it should have been, but it opened easily under my hand. Beyond it lay another tunnel, another arrow pointing deeper into the darkness, another chance to read the water drops correctly. I pulled the door closed behind me and started walking, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me through the familiar darkness. Somewhere in the distance I could hear footsteps. Someone else who'd just taken the job, who'd just discovered that some leaks can't be fixed because they're not leaks at all. They're invitations. And in a building that constructs itself around the people who enter it, the only way out is to keep going deeper, following arrows that point toward the center of something that was never really a school at all. I walked until my flashlight began to dim, then kept walking in the darkness, guided by the sound of water dropping and the smell of chalk dust and the certain knowledge that somewhere ahead, another me was waiting to explain how the emergency exits work when the emergency never really ends. The water spells it out clearly, once you learn to read it correctly. And down here in the dark, with the weight of an impossible building pressing down from above, I finally understand what reverse really means. Story 6. The contract should have been my first warning. 3 months' rent paid up front for a single night's work, filming a music video in a place the record label described only as atmospheric. When I pressed for details, they mentioned it was a rural hospital that had been abandoned for decades. Perfect for the band's aesthetic, they said. The kind of place that would give their industrial metal the edge it needed. I arrived at sunset, my equipment truck grinding up the winding dirt road that led to what had once been St. Catherine's Medical Center. The building squatted against the darkening sky like a cancer, its brick facade stained with decades of rain and neglect. Windows gaped black and empty, their glass long since shattered or removed. Rust-colored stains streaked down from the broken gutters, and ivy had claimed most of the eastern wall, giving the structure an organic, diseased appearance. The band's tour manager, Marcus, met me at the front entrance. He was twitchy, constantly checking his phone, and kept glancing at the building as if it might collapse at any moment. When I asked about permits and safety clearances, he waved me off, insisting everything was handled. The band would arrive around midnight, he said, giving me time to scout locations and set up the preliminary shots. The inside of the hospital was worse than the exterior. The air hung thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something organic and sweet that made my stomach turn. My footsteps echoed through empty corridors lined with peeling paint and graffiti tags left by previous trespassers. Most of the doors hung open, revealing stripped rooms where medical equipment had once stood. The fluorescent light fixtures dangled at odd angles, some still containing tubes that flickered weakly when I tested the power. Surprisingly, electricity still flowed through parts of the building. Emergency lighting cast sickly yellow pools every few feet, creating a patchwork of shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I set up my cameras in what had been the main lobby, a cavernous space with a reception desk that still bore the ghostly outline of removed signage. That's when I first saw him. The security guard appeared around 9 o'clock, materializing from one of the darker corridors as if he'd been waiting in the shadows. He wore a standard uniform, navy blue with reflective strips. But where his face should have been, a mirrored helmet covered his entire head. Not a motorcycle helmet or anything practical, but something that looked almost custom-made, its surface perfectly reflective and seamless. I called out a greeting, but he didn't respond. Instead, he positioned himself near the far wall and remained perfectly still. Like a mannequin placed there for decoration, the helmet caught the emergency lighting and threw it back in distorted fragments, creating moving patterns on the ceiling that made me dizzy if I watched too long. Marcus had mentioned security would be present but hadn't provided details. I assumed the guard was deaf or simply taking his job seriously. Still, something about his absolute stillness unsettled me. In 40 minutes of observation, I never saw him move. Not once. Not even the subtle shift of weight from foot to foot that marks a living person. I continued my setup, positioning cameras at various angles throughout the lobby and testing sight lines for the performance shots. The building's acoustics were incredible. Every sound seemed to linger longer than it should, creating an almost ethereal quality that would work perfectly for the band's atmospheric pieces. It was while adjusting the angle on my primary camera that I noticed something odd. The camera's LCD monitor showed the lobby from its perspective, but the security guard's helmet appeared different on screen. Instead of reflecting the emergency lights in my equipment, it showed something else entirely. My own face stared back at me from the helmet's surface, but the image was wrong. Delayed. I raised my hand to wave, and the reflection followed a few seconds later, like a video with the audio out of sync. More disturbing, the version of me in the helmet looked tired, stressed, with dark circles under my eyes that hadn't been there when I'd checked my appearance in the truck's mirror. I lowered the camera and looked directly at the guard. The helmet showed only the normal reflections of the room. When I raised the camera again, there was my delayed, exhausted doppelganger, moving just behind my actual movements. My hands began to shake as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Camera sensors sometimes picked up infrared or processed light differently than human eyes. Maybe the helmet had some kind of coating that interfered with digital recording. But when I switched to my backup camera, the same phenomenon occurred. The delayed reflection bothered me less than its appearance. The me in the helmet looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Someone who'd been pushed beyond normal limits. As I watched, that other version of myself rubbed his temples as if fighting a headache I didn't yet have. I decided to test something. Keeping the camera trained on the guard, I set it to record and moved to a different position. The helmet's reflection showed my movement several seconds after I'd completed it, but with an accuracy that ruled out any kind of pre-recorded image. It was definitely me, definitely real time, just later. Then the reflection did something I hadn't done yet. The me in the helmet pulled out my phone and checked the time, a gesture I was planning to make but hadn't executed. As I watched, fascinated and horrified, my reflection showed increasing agitation, pacing back and forth in a pattern I recognized as my own nervous habit. He checked his phone repeatedly, then looked directly at one of my cameras with an expression of growing panic. I lowered the camera, my mouth dry. The actual guard remained motionless, his helmet reflecting nothing but the room's emergency lighting. But I could feel something building in my chest, the exact anxiety I'd seen on my reflection's face. Almost involuntarily, I pulled out my phone. The time showed 10:47 p.m. The band wasn't due for another hour, but I found myself checking for missed calls or messages with the same compulsive repetition I'd witnessed in the helmet. The next hour passed in a haze of setup and increasing unease. Every time I pointed a camera at the security guard, the helmet showed me future versions of myself. Always 30 minutes ahead, always displaying emotions and actions that felt inevitable once I saw them. I watched myself argue with someone on the phone, though my phone remained silent. I saw myself frantically adjusting camera settings for problems that hadn't occurred yet. Most disturbing, I observed myself backing away from something with a look of absolute terror, though the helmet never revealed what had frightened me. The band arrived precisely at midnight, their van's headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. 4 musicians in typical industrial metal gear, leather, chains, and aggressive makeup that would photograph beautifully in the hospital's decay. Their lead singer, a woman who introduced herself as Sever, had worked with my previous client and specifically requested me for this shoot. She surveyed the lobby with obvious satisfaction, running her hands along the water-stained walls and testing the acoustics with a few experimental vocalizations. The sound bounced through the space magnificently, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality that gave me chills. We began filming around 12:30 a.m. The first few shots went smoothly, atmospheric footage of the band moving through the corridors, close-ups of instruments against the hospital's deteriorating backdrop. The security guard remained in his position, still as a statue, and I kept my cameras pointed away from him. But during a break between songs, while reviewing footage on my main camera, I accidentally swept across the guard's position. The helmet filled the frame, and what I saw there made my blood freeze. The reflection showed the same lobby, but 30 minutes in the future. In that image, one of my cameras lay shattered on the floor, its lens assembly scattered across the tiles. Sever stood over it with an expression of fury, screaming something at me while the other band members looked on in obvious distress. Most alarming, the future version of myself cowered against the far wall, clutching his head as if in severe pain. I jerked the camera away, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. The actual lobby remained calm. Sever was joking with her bandmates while they prepared for the next shot. Nothing suggested the confrontation I'd witnessed in the helmet. But as I watched the singer, I began to notice small signs of irritation. She checked her phone repeatedly, frowning at the time. When her guitarist made a suggestion about the next shot, she snapped at him more harshly than the comment deserved. The mood was shifting, just as the helmet had predicted. I tried to continue filming, but my focus was shot. Every movement, every gesture felt predetermined. When Sever asked me to adjust the lighting for a particular shot, I found myself refusing with a vehemence that surprised us both. She stared at me for a long moment, her makeup making her expression unreadable in the emergency lighting. "Is there a problem?" she asked, and I could hear the edge creeping into her voice, the same tone I'd witnessed in the helmet's reflection. I mumbled an apology and made the adjustment, but the damage was done. The atmosphere had shifted from professional collaboration to barely contained tension. The other band members exchanged glances, and I caught the drummer checking his watch. Everything was unfolding exactly as the helmet had shown me. Desperate to break the pattern, I deliberately moved one of my cameras to a different position than I'd planned. But when I glanced at the security guard, The helmet's reflection showed the future me moving it back to the original spot. I was trapped in a temporal loop, watching my own actions play out before I made them. The breaking point came during the final song. Sever was in the middle of an intense vocal performance when one of my lights flickered and died. In the sudden shift of illumination, she stumbled slightly, and her voice cracked on a crucial note. The moment stretched in horrible slow motion. I could see her building fury, the same expression I'd witnessed in the helmet 30 minutes earlier. She turned on me with volcanic rage, demanding to know why I couldn't maintain basic equipment. Her words echoed through the hospital, bouncing off the walls and multiplying into a cacophony of accusation. In her anger, she kicked out at the nearest camera, sending it crashing to the floor exactly as the helmet had predicted. I found myself backing against the wall, overwhelmed by the sensation that this had all happened before, that I was merely an actor playing out a script written in the security guard's impossible reflections. The pain in my head was blinding, a feedback loop of predestination that felt like my skull might crack. But as I pressed my palms against my temples, a terrible realization struck me. I looked at the security guard, still motionless in his position, and then at the shattered camera on the floor. The scene matched the helmet's prediction perfectly, which meant I was the 30-minute delay. Everything I'd seen in the helmet's reflection had been real, but it had been real 30 minutes before I experienced it. The security guard wasn't showing me the future. He was showing me the present, and I was the one existing in the past. Somehow the hospital had trapped me in a temporal echo, forcing me to live through events that had already concluded. The implications were staggering. The exhausted version of myself I'd seen in the first reflection hadn't been a prediction. It had been me as I actually was, my true state hidden from my delayed perception. The anxiety, the building tension, the inevitable confrontation, all of it had already happened. I was just catching up. I stood there in the ruins of the chute, watching Sever storm out with her bandmates, and wondered how long I'd been trapped in this loop. Hours? Days? The security guard remained perfectly still, his mirrored helmet reflecting the present I couldn't quite reach. As the band's van disappeared down the dirt road, I realized the horrible truth. The only way to end this was to create a perfect match, to live through the events exactly as the helmet had shown them. Every gesture, every word, every moment of terror had to be identical to escape the loop. But standing there in the empty hospital, surrounded by the ghosts of 30-minute-old events, I began to wonder if the security guard was trapped too. If his perfect stillness wasn't vigilance but paralysis, the stance of someone who had seen his own future so many times that movement had become impossible. I picked up my remaining camera with shaking hands and pointed it at the mirrored helmet one last time. The reflection showed the lobby as it was, empty, lit by emergency lights, with broken equipment scattered across the floor. No future, no past, just the eternal present moment of this decaying place. The security guard stood there, motionless as ever, and I realized with a chill that he might have no face at all beneath that helmet, that he might be nothing more than the hospital's memory of security, a recording playing back endlessly in the space between moments. I left my equipment and walked toward the exit, but even as I reached the door, I could feel the building's pull. Tomorrow night, another filmmaker would arrive. The cycle would begin again, and somewhere in the darkness, the faceless guard would stand sentinel over a lobby where time moved like thick honey, showing visitors their own delayed reflections until they, too, became part of the hospital's endless playback. The dirt road stretched ahead of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd walked it before, 30 minutes ago, in someone else's camera, in someone else's memory of escape. Story 7. The farmhouse squatted against the Nebraska horizon like a wound in the earth, its weathered clapboards siding the color of old bone. I'd driven 3 hours from Omaha to reach this isolation, seeking the kind of silence that city apartments couldn't provide. My novel had stalled at chapter 12, the characters refusing to cooperate, their voices growing fainter with each passing day. The classified ad had promised complete solitude for serious writers, and the monthly rate was suspiciously reasonable. Dr. Marcus Kellman had left the key exactly where he'd said, under the ceramic owl beside the front steps. No face-to-face meeting, just a brief phone conversation where his voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He'd mentioned his frequent travels, something about medical conferences and research opportunities abroad. The house would be mine for as long as I needed. The first voicemail waited on the ancient answering machine, its red light blinking like a digital heartbeat. Welcome to the house. I trust you'll find it conducive to your work. One simple rule: use only the illuminated rooms. I've programmed the electrical system for efficiency. The other spaces aren't necessary for a single occupant. Enjoy your stay. His voice held an odd formality, each word precisely enunciated as if he were dictating surgical notes. I replayed the message twice, unsettled by something I couldn't quite identify. The house hummed around me with the particular silence of occupied spaces, settling wood, whispered drafts, the distant tick of an unseen clock. The illuminated rooms formed a sensible circuit: kitchen, living room, a small bedroom upstairs, and a cramped bathroom. Basic necessities. The other doors remained closed, their brass handles tarnished with age. When I tested one experimentally, the darkness beyond felt thick and expectant, as if it had been waiting. I spent the first week in productive solitude, my characters finally beginning to speak again. The isolation worked its magic. My protagonist found his voice, and the plot lurched forward with renewed momentum. I barely noticed the rooms I couldn't access, content with my functional little kingdom of light. The pattern began on Thursday night. I was working late, lost in a particularly difficult scene, when I became aware of a subtle change in the house's atmosphere. A soft click echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, followed by the barely perceptible hum of electricity. When I looked up from my laptop, a thin line of yellow light outlined a door I'd never opened, the one leading to what I assumed was a dining room. The light waited. I stared at it for several minutes, my fingers suspended over the keyboard. Dr. Kelman's message replayed in my memory: use only the illuminated rooms. But this room was illuminated now, wasn't it? The logic felt slippery, like trying to grasp water. I returned to my writing, but the awareness of that light pulled at my peripheral vision like an itch. When I finally looked again, it was gone. The door had returned to darkness, as if nothing had happened. The second voicemail arrived Friday morning. I hope you're settling in well. The house has its own rhythms. You'll learn to appreciate them. Remember, follow only where you're invited. The property has a history of guiding those who listen. The word guiding lingered in the kitchen air long after the message ended. I replayed it 3 times, searching for nuance in Dr. Kelman's tone. Each repetition made it sound stranger, more loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. Friday night, the lights came again. This time I was ready, watching. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the dining room door outlined itself in amber. I waited, my breath shallow, until a second click sounded from deeper in the house. Another door, further along what I imagined must be a hallway, began to glow. The path was unmistakable. I stood in the living room doorway, my bare feet cold against the hardwood, following the progression of lights as they bloomed one by one through the house's hidden geography. Each new illumination clicked on just as I located the previous one, creating a breadcrumb trail that curved through rooms I'd never seen, leading toward the back of the property. The final light, brighter than the others, appeared in what I now realized was the barn. It glowed through the kitchen window, steady and patient, waiting for me to follow. I didn't. Instead, I retreated to the bedroom, pulling the covers over my head like a child afraid of monsters. But sleep wouldn't come. In the silence between my heartbeats, I heard something that made my skin prickle, a soft, rhythmic tinkling, like metal touching metal. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filtering through the walls themselves. Stethoscopes. I was certain of it, though I couldn't explain how I knew. The distinctive clink of the chest piece against the metal tubing, the sound every doctor made when they walked, when they worked, when they... The noise stopped abruptly, leaving me in a silence so complete, it felt like deafness. Saturday's voicemail was longer, Dr. Kelman's voice carrying a note of gentle insistence. The path is meant to be followed. The house is trying to show you something important. Don't resist the invitation. Resistance only makes things more difficult. Trust the process. Trust the illumination. The way he said trust made my stomach clench. It was the voice of someone who'd never had his authority questioned, who expected compliance without explanation. I found myself wondering about his patients, whether they'd felt this same uncomfortable pressure to submit. I tried to lose myself in writing, but my protagonist had grown uncooperative again, his dialogue sounding forced and artificial. The house seemed to pulse around me with barely contained energy, as if it were holding its breath. Every shadow looked deeper, every creak more deliberate. Sunday night, I made a discovery that changed everything. The lights began their sequence earlier, 10:30 p.m. this time, and I followed them with my eyes, mapping their progression through the house's layout. But instead of stopping at the barn, they continued. A new light appeared, then another, sketching a path I hadn't seen before. Unable to resist, I crept to the back door and peered through its glass panels. The barn's interior was fully illuminated now, and I could see through its open doors to the space beyond. What I'd assumed was a simple storage building revealed itself as something far more complex. Gleaming metal surfaces caught the light. Tables, equipment, banks of instruments arranged with surgical precision. It wasn't just a barn. It was a medical facility. The realization hit me like cold water. Dr. Kelman hadn't simply rented me his farmhouse, he'd rented me his practice. But what kind of doctor operated out of a barn in the middle of nowhere? What kind of procedures required this level of isolation? The tinkling sound returned, louder now, accompanied by other noises that made my throat tighten. The whisper of rubber wheels on concrete, the soft beep of electronic monitors, the rhythmic hiss of something that sounded disturbingly like a ventilator. I stumbled backward from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sounds continued, building into a symphony of medical activity that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Somewhere in that cacophony, I could swear I heard voices, muffled, professional, urgent. Monday's voicemail was the last one. You're almost ready. I can tell by your resistance. It means you're beginning to understand. The work I do here is important, necessary. The patients come to me when conventional medicine fails them. They need what I can provide, what the barn offers. Tonight, follow the path completely. Don't stop at observation. Step inside and see what you're truly here to witness. The machine clicked off, leaving me staring at its blinking light. The word patience echoed in my mind, but I hadn't seen anyone else on the property. No cars in the driveway, no signs of human activity beyond my own presence, unless the patients didn't arrive by car, unless they were already here, waiting in the illuminated rooms I'd been forbidden to enter. Monday night, I sat in the living room with every light blazing, my laptop closed and forgotten. When the sequence began at 10:15 p.m., I watched with the fascination of a man observing his own execution. The lights traced their familiar path, but this time they seemed brighter, more insistent. The tinkling of stethoscopes began before the barn illuminated, a gentle percussion that seemed to call my name. I stood. I walked to the back door. I placed my hand on the cool metal of the handle. Through the glass, the barn waited. The surgical lights cast everything in harsh relief. Operating tables prepared with fresh linens, instrument trays arranged with geometric precision, monitors glowing with readouts I couldn't interpret. But there was something else now, something that made my vision blur and my grip on the door handle tighten until my knuckles went white. Figures moved in the space between the tables. Indistinct at first, like heat shimmer on summer asphalt, they gradually resolved into recognizable shapes. Medical personnel in surgical scrubs, their faces hidden behind masks, their movements choreographed with the efficiency of practiced routine. They worked around tables that appeared to be occupied, though I couldn't make out the details of the patients from this distance. One of the figures looked up. Even through the mask, I felt the weight of their attention, the sensation of being seen and measured and found. Suitable. The figure raised a gloved hand and beckoned. I opened the door. The night air carried scents that shouldn't exist. Antiseptic, anesthesia, the metallic tang of surgical steel. My feet found the gravel path without conscious direction, carrying me toward the barn's open doors. The sounds grew clearer with each step. The steady beep of heart monitors, the whisper of oxygen masks, the soft consultations between medical professionals. I reached the threshold and stopped. The barn was empty. No tables, no equipment, no mysterious surgical team. Just hay bales and farming implements, dusty and undisturbed. Cobwebs stretched between the rafters, and the air smelled of nothing more exotic than old straw and machine oil. I spun around, searching for some explanation, some sign that what I'd seen moments before had been real. The house squatted behind me, most of its windows dark, only the rooms I'd been using still glowing with warm light. But as I watched, another light clicked on, then another. The sequence began again, tracing the same path through the darkness, leading back to where I stood in the empty barn. I understood then. The path didn't lead to something. It led from something. I wasn't being invited to witness. I was being invited to participate. The barn wasn't Dr. Kelman's surgery. It was mine. The patients weren't his. They were waiting for me. I walked back to the house, climbed the stairs to the bedroom, and packed my things. I left the key under the ceramic owl and drove away without looking back, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. 3 months later, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. "The house is available again," Dr. Kelman's voice said without preamble. "I think you're ready now. The work is waiting for you to return." I hung up, but the phone rang again immediately. And again, each time, the same message, the same patient invitation to return to the illuminated path. I've changed my number twice since then, moved to a different state, but the calls follow me. Sometimes it's Dr. Kelman's voice, sometimes others. Always professional, always certain that I belong in that barn, that the work needs me to continue. The book I went there to write remains unfinished. Whenever I try to work on it, my protagonist's voice changes, becomes clinical and precise, discussing procedures I've never learned and patients I've never seen. The words flow easily now, too easily, as if someone else is guiding my fingers across the keyboard. I've started sleeping with the lights on. In the darkness, I hear the tinkling of stethoscopes in the walls, getting closer each night, reminding me that some paths, once illuminated, never truly go dark. The phone is ringing again. I know I shouldn't answer it, but the sound is so persistent, so patient. Dr. Kelman's voice will be waiting on the other end, and this time, I think I might finally be ready to listen. After all, the work must continue. The patients are waiting, and the barn's surgical lights are so much brighter than the darkness I've been trying to hide in. I reach for the phone. Story 8. The first thing that hit me wasn't the smell of rust and decay I'd expected, but silence so complete it felt like being underwater. Mallory Industrial had been shuttered for 3 years, yet here I stood in its main production floor, clipboard in hand, tasked with determining whether the building could be salvaged or if the city should just tear it down. The insurance company wanted a thorough inspection, and as the only structural engineer willing to work weekends, I'd drawn the short straw. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, each click of my boots against concrete seeming to hang in the air longer than physics should allow. Overhead, a maze of ventilation ducts snaked between support beams like metal arteries, their surfaces coated in a film of industrial grime that caught the weak afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. Everything looked exactly as I'd expected from the preliminary reports, except for the gentle hum coming from somewhere deep within the building's mechanical systems. That hum shouldn't exist. The power had been cut to this facility years ago. I pulled out my phone to call the city inspector who'd given me the keys, but no signal. Of course. The thick concrete walls and metal framework turned the place into a digital dead zone. I'd noticed that driving in, but somehow it felt more oppressive now, standing alone in this tomb of American manufacturing. The inspection checklist was straightforward enough. Structural integrity, electrical systems, HVAC functionality, environmental hazards. I started with the basics. testing floor stability and checking for obvious damage. The building seemed solid, surprisingly so for its age and abandonment. But that humming continued, a low frequency that I felt more than heard, like the building itself was breathing around me. When I reached the section marked ventilation assessment on my clipboard, I finally had to investigate the source of that sound. Following the main ductwork led me to a control room tucked into the factory's northeast corner, its door slightly ajar. Inside, banks of switches and monitoring equipment lined the walls, most of them dark and dead. But 3 panels showed faint green lights, their displays flickering with readings I couldn't interpret. The exhaust system control panel sat in the center, a massive board of levers, gauges and indicator lights that belonged to an era when everything industrial was built to last forever. According to my building schematics, this system should have been completely dormant, yet several dials showed active pressure readings, and that persistent humming was definitely coming from somewhere behind the walls. I tried the main power switch. Nothing. The emergency shutoff lever. Still nothing. The system seemed to be running on some kind of backup power that wasn't listed in any of the documentation I'd received. My engineering instincts told me to find the source, but something else, something I couldn't quite name, whispered that I should leave it alone. Instead, I did what any rational person would do. I held my breath to listen more carefully. The moment my lungs stopped moving, the humming changed. Not stopped, but shifted into a different rhythm, like a massive machine synchronizing with some new input. Air began moving through the ducts above my head with purpose, no longer the random creaks and settling sounds of an old building, but the deliberate whoosh of an active ventilation system. I exhaled sharply, and the airflow stuttered, then resumed its original pattern. This had to be coincidence. Old buildings developed acoustic quirks, and pressure changes from weather could activate dormant systems in unexpected ways. I was probably just imagining the correlation between my breathing and the factory's responses. But as I stood there, listening to the way the air moved through hidden passages, I found myself unconsciously holding my breath again. The response was immediate and unmistakable. The ventilation system came alive with a soft roar, and I could feel air pressure shifting around me like invisible hands adjusting the atmosphere itself. Somewhere in the building's depths, pumps activated and valves opened. The factory was waking up, and it was doing so in rhythm with my respiration. My hands began to shake as I marked notes on my clipboard, though I wasn't sure what to write. Ventilation system responds to inspector's breathing patterns. Seemed like the kind of comment that would get me referred for psychological evaluation. But the evidence was undeniable. Every time I held my breath, the building held its breath with me. When I breathed normally, it settled back into that low, steady hum. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps there was some kind of pressure sensor I'd missed, something that detected changes in the ambient air when I stopped breathing. Or maybe there was still someone else in the building, someone who could see me through security cameras and was manipulating the controls remotely as some kind of elaborate prank. But as I walked back toward the main production floor, testing my theory with deliberate breath holding, a new possibility crept into my consciousness. The building's responses weren't just matching my breathing, they were anticipating it. I stood perfectly still in the center of the factory floor and focused on my natural breathing rhythm. In, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. The ventilation system matched me perfectly, its cycling synchronized to my respiratory rate with mechanical precision. But then I decided to hold my breath without warning, and the system began adjusting before I'd even stopped inhaling. My skin prickled with the sudden certainty that something was watching me. Not someone. Something. The building itself felt aware, attentive, like it was studying my patterns and learning to predict my needs. Every breath I took seemed to feed data into some vast, hidden intelligence that processed my biological rhythms and responded accordingly. I forced myself to continue the inspection, documenting structural issues and taking photographs, but my attention kept drifting to the subtle ways the building reacted to my presence. When I climbed a ladder to check ceiling joints, the air pressure shifted to steady me. When I knelt to examine floor drains, the temperature seemed to adjust for my comfort. It was as if the factory was trying to take care of me, to create optimal conditions for my work. The realization should have been comforting. Instead, it terrified me. By the time I reached the electrical control room, my nerves were stretched taut. The main breaker panel stood open, its rows of switches labeled in faded ink that I had to squint to read. Most were in the off position, as expected, but several showed signs of recent activation, scratches in the accumulated dust, fingerprints that looked too fresh for a building abandoned 3 years ago. I photographed the panel, noting which circuits appeared to have power, then reached for the main exhaust system breaker. If I could kill power to whatever was running the ventilation, maybe I could think clearly enough to figure out what was really happening here. The moment my fingers touched the switch, I saw my shadow on the wall beside the panel, but the shadow wasn't reaching toward the switch I was touching. It was manipulating other controls, working levers and adjusting dials with smooth, practiced movements that my actual body wasn't making. I jerked my hand back and spun around, looking for the light source that could be creating such a distorted projection. But the lighting in the room was even and diffuse, coming from several overhead fixtures that should have produced a simple, accurate shadow. When I looked back at the wall, my shadow was still there, still operating controls independently of my movements. I raised my left hand, and the shadow raised its left hand. I turned my head, and the shadow turned its head. But its other hand continued working, adjusting settings on equipment I wasn't even looking at. The factory's humming grew deeper, more complex, as if additional systems were coming online. I could hear the distant groan of heavy machinery starting up, the whoosh of air through larger ducts, the rhythmic clank of automated processes that shouldn't exist in an abandoned building. My shadow finished its work and returned to normal positioning, mimicking my movements exactly. But the damage was done. The building had shown me that it didn't need my conscious cooperation to operate. It was learning from me, copying my patterns, and somehow using that knowledge to run itself. I tried to tell myself that shadows were just tricks of light and perception, that stress and isolation were making me see things that weren't there. But the evidence surrounded me in the form of active machinery, controlled air pressure, and the growing sense that the building was not just responsive to my presence, it was feeding on it. The inspection checklist in my hands felt suddenly absurd. How do you evaluate the structural integrity of a building that might be alive? How do you assess the safety of electrical systems that operate themselves? I'd been sent here to determine whether this place should be demolished. But what if demolition wasn't possible? What if the factory had developed some kind of self-preservation instinct? I moved through the remaining areas quickly, documenting what I could while fighting the growing conviction that I was being studied as much as I was studying. Every breath I took seemed to provide more data to whatever intelligence was emerging from the intersection of obsolete machinery and something far stranger. The final area on my list was the basement mechanical room, where the building's major systems converged. I'd been dreading this part of the inspection, and now I understood why. The basement would be where the building's newfound consciousness was strongest, where all its learning and adaptation culminated in direct control over the most fundamental aspects of its operation. The stairs leading down were darker than they should be, lit by emergency lighting that cast long shadows and left too many corners in darkness. Each step echoed with a hollow sound that suggested vast empty spaces beyond what I could see. But it wasn't really empty, was it? The building was full of presence now, aware and watching and learning. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the mechanical room exactly as described in the blueprints, except for the soft blue glow emanating from monitoring equipment that should have been completely dead. Banks of sensors lined the walls, their displays showing readouts of temperature, pressure, humidity, and other measurements I couldn't identify. But the data patterns looked familiar, and after a moment of staring, I realized why. They were tracking biological rhythms, heart rate, breathing patterns, body temperature, stress indicators. The building wasn't just responding to my presence. It was conducting a complete medical evaluation, monitoring my vital signs with the precision of hospital equipment. As I stood there watching the displays update in real time, showing the acceleration of my pulse and the increasing shallowness of my breathing, I finally understood what was happening. The factory hadn't learned to mimic my patterns. It had learned to supplement them. When I held my breath, the building's ventilation system didn't just respond. It took over, ensuring that air continued to circulate, that oxygen levels remained stable, that the environment could sustain life even when my own respiratory system failed to function. The building was keeping me alive. But why? And more importantly, what did it want in return? I backed toward the stairs, but the sensors tracked my movement, and I could hear systems adjusting throughout the building to accommodate my retreat. The factory was learning from every step, every breath, every heartbeat, building a more complete picture of human physiology and behavior. By the time I reached the main floor again, I was running. Not because anything was chasing me, but because I finally understood the true horror of my situation. The building wasn't trying to trap me or harm me. It was trying to take care of me, to create the perfect environment for human habitation. And once it finished learning everything it could from my patterns, what would stop it from trying to keep me here permanently, maintaining optimal conditions for the specimen that had taught it so much about the delicate requirements of human life? I reached my car as the sun was setting, my clipboard filled with notes that would never make sense to anyone else. The building watched me leave through windows that seemed to follow my movement, its systems still humming with the rhythms it had learned from my body. 3 days later, I submitted my report recommending immediate demolition due to structural instabilities and electrical hazards. The city approved the recommendation without question, and Mallory Industrial was scheduled for destruction the following month. But demolition day came and went, and the building stands unchanged. The construction crew reported equipment failures, power outages, and a series of minor accidents that made the work too dangerous to continue. They've scheduled a second attempt, but I don't think it will succeed. The factory has learned too much about survival, both its own and ours. It knows how to breathe now, how to maintain the delicate balance that keeps complex systems functioning. And somewhere in its mechanical consciousness, it's still holding its breath, waiting for the next person who might teach it something new about what it means to be alive. I drive past the building sometimes, always holding my breath as I pass, and I swear I can see my shadow in those grimy windows. Still there in the control room, still operating equipment with movements I never made, keeping the factory alive with patterns it learned from my body. The question that haunts me isn't whether the building is real or if I imagined the whole thing. The question is, what happens when it finishes learning and decides it no longer needs teachers? Story 9. The camera's weight pulled at my neck as I stood before the skeletal remains of the Riverside housing complex. 23 floors of broken dreams stretched toward a pewter sky, each window a hollow eye socket staring back at nothing. The contest submission required authenticity, real abandonment, real decay, real desperation captured in silver halide and shadow. What I hadn't expected was how the building seemed to lean inward, as if listening to my footsteps on the cracked asphalt. The security chain hung loose from the main entrance, links corroded to rust-brown flakes that stained my fingers. Inside, the lobby stretched into darkness, punctuated by shafts of gray light filtering through boarded windows. My boots echoed against chipped marble, the sound bouncing off walls that had once been cream-colored, but now bore the patina of neglect, water stains mapping invisible rivers, graffiti spelling out names of people who had probably moved on or given up. I'd researched the place beforehand. Built in 1987 as affordable housing, abandoned in 2019 when the city council declared it structurally unsound. The real story lay between those dates. Families packed into concrete boxes, dreams deferred in fluorescent-lit hallways, children who grew up thinking this was what home looked like. My camera could capture the physical decay, but the emotional residue required something more intuitive. The first apartment I chose was on the second floor, Unit 2B. The door hung ajar, revealing a space that someone had once called home. Pale rectangles on the walls marked where pictures had hung. Family photos, probably, or inspirational posters about hope and perseverance. The kitchen counter bore circular stains from coffee mugs, and I found myself wondering about morning routines, about rushed breakfasts before school or work. I was adjusting my camera settings when I heard it. The doorbell rang. My finger froze on the aperture dial. The sound was crisp, electronic, the two-tone chime of a basic apartment doorbell. But as I glanced around the empty room, I noticed what should have been obvious. No electricity. The outlets were dead holes in the walls, and the overhead fixture hung like a gutted fish, its bulb long since removed or shattered. I approached the front door carefully, camera hanging forgotten around my neck. The doorbell button sat flush against the door frame, a simple white circle surrounded by scratched plastic. When I pressed it experimentally, nothing happened. No sound, no vibration, no response at all. That's when I felt it. The grip started at my ankle, sudden and precise, like fingers wrapping around bone through my boot. The pressure was cold, not just temperature cold, but the kind of cold that seems to bypass skin entirely and settle into marrow. I jerked my foot upward, but the sensation followed, climbing slowly up my calf with deliberate intent. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp intake that echoed in the empty room. The moment air filled my lungs, really filled them deep and controlled, the grip loosened. Not disappeared, just retreated, like something testing my resolve, measuring my capacity for calm. I stood there for several heartbeats, analyzing what had just happened. Stress reaction, probably. The combination of the abandoned building, the strange doorbell sound, and my own expectations creating a psychosomatic response. I'd read about photographers experiencing unusual sensations in emotionally charged locations. The mind, after all, was remarkably creative when it came to filling in blanks. But the explanation felt thin, even as I clung to it. I moved to the next apartment. Unit 2C had been stripped more thoroughly. No furniture remained, just impressions in the carpet where heavy pieces had sat for years. The walls were bare except for a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, a crayon family holding hands under a yellow sun. I almost removed it for artistic contrast, then stopped. Some things deserved to remain undisturbed. I was framing a shot of light streaming through a broken blinds when the second doorbell rang. This time I was ready for it, or thought I was. The same two-tone chime, impossible and clear. And again, the grip, but different now. It started higher, at my knee, and the fingers felt longer, more insistent. They climbed with purpose, tracing the back of my leg like someone mapping territory. I forced myself to breathe deeply, counting to 10 as air moved in and out of my lungs. The grip faltered, loosened, but didn't disappear entirely. It hovered just below my thigh, waiting. A pattern was emerging. Doorbell, grip, breath, relief. Some kind of test, though I couldn't fathom the rules or the purpose. I found myself moving more quickly through the remaining second-floor units, documenting empty rooms with hurried efficiency. But each apartment contained a doorbell, and each doorbell eventually rang. By Unit 2H, the grip was reaching my waist. The third floor offered no respite. If anything, the doorbell sound seemed louder here, more insistent. In Unit 3A, I discovered something that made my hands shake as I adjusted the camera settings. The doorbell button was missing entirely, just two wires protruding from a hole in the door frame, their copper ends blackened with age. Yet when the chime sounded, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the walls themselves. The grip that followed started at my ribcage. I found myself developing strategies. Controlled breathing exercises learned from a meditation app I'd tried once and abandoned. Counting techniques, focusing on the weight of the camera, the texture of the lens barrel, anything tangible and real. The grips would retreat, but never completely, and each floor brought them higher on my body. By the 8th floor, I understood that something was testing my limits. The apartments here showed signs of more recent habitation. Mattresses dragged into corners, candles melted into puddles of wax, spray-painted messages that spoke of desperation and defiance. Squatters, probably, finding temporary shelter in rooms that had been intended for families, but ended up housing only echoes. In Unit 8F, I found a journal. The handwriting was neat, careful, the kind of script taught in schools that cared about penmanship. The entries were dated sporadically over several months, chronicling a gradual descent into something that felt uncomfortably familiar. Day 3. The doorbells are getting worse. Started on the first floor, but now they're following me up. Jenny thinks I'm losing it, but she doesn't hear them. Maybe she's right. Maybe I am. Day 12. Figured out the breathing thing. Deep, controlled breaths seem to help, like it's testing whether I can stay calm. But why? What does it want? Day 28. Made it to the 15th floor today. The grips are getting stronger. Jenny left yesterday. Said she couldn't watch me destroy myself over an empty building. She doesn't understand that leaving isn't an option anymore. Day 35. Something lives in the bells. Or maybe something lives in me. The difference is becoming harder to distinguish. The final entry was written in a different hand, shakier, desperate. Day 41, 23rd floor. If anyone finds this, don't go up. Don't listen to the bells. They're not testing your sanity. They're testing your will to remain yourself. I dropped the journal, pages scattering across the dusty floor. My camera felt suddenly heavy, an anchor dragging me towards something I didn't want to understand. The smart thing would be to leave, walk out, submit the photos I'd already taken, forget about the upper floors. But the doorbell in Unit 8F rang just then, and the grip that followed reached my throat. The sensation was unlike the others. Not fingers now, but a presence. Something vast and patient that had been climbing toward my consciousness with methodical determination. When I breathed deeply, it didn't retreat. It waited, exploring the edges of my awareness like water testing the limits of a dam. I could feel my pulse against whatever was holding me, could sense my own heartbeat being examined and cataloged. This wasn't a test of nerve or sanity. This was an evaluation, a careful assessment of my capacity to remain intact. The higher floors blurred together in a haze of empty rooms and impossible doorbell sounds. Each chime brought the presence closer to something vital, some core of self that I'd never had to defend before. I developed the habit of pressing my back against walls, as if the solid surface could anchor me to reality. I spoke aloud, describing what I was seeing. Hearing my own voice confirmed that I still existed as a separate entity. Empty apartment, broken windows, light coming in from the east. The words felt like lifelines, proof that I retained the ability to observe and articulate. But by the 18th floor, even speech was becoming unreliable. Words would form in my mind, but emerge from my mouth changed, as if something else was editing my thoughts in real time. I caught myself saying things I hadn't intended, describing rooms that didn't match what my eyes were seeing. The 20th floor contained only 2 apartments. In the first, I found a mirror, somehow unbroken despite years of abandonment. When I looked into it, my reflection took a half-second longer than it should have to mimic my movements. In that delay, I glimpsed something behind my own eyes, something that had been climbing steadily upward and was now very close to reaching its destination. The final doorbell rang as I stood before the stairway to the 21st floor. This time, the grip encompassed everything. Not just my body, but my thoughts, my memories, my sense of continuity. I felt myself being measured against some unknowable standard, evaluated for fitness or compatibility. The presence that had been climbing through me settled into place like a key finding its lock. I understood then that the building hadn't been abandoned because of structural problems. It had been abandoned because something had moved in, something that required specific conditions to thrive. Empty spaces, isolated subjects, the gradual erosion of certainty that came with prolonged exposure to the impossible. The contest had been real. My photography equipment was real. But everything else, the journal, the systematic progression through floors, the careful cultivation of my doubt, had been designed to bring me to this moment of perfect receptivity. I climbed to the 21st floor because I no longer had the capacity to choose otherwise. The apartments here were different. Furnished, lived in, but not by anyone human. The furniture sat at wrong angles. The decorations followed patterns that hurt to examine directly. In one room I found dozens of cameras, professional equipment like mine, arranged in neat rows like trophies or tools awaiting use. I understood that I would be adding my camera to the collection soon. The 22nd floor contained a single vast room where others like me sat in perfect stillness. Photographers, journalists, urban explorers, people drawn to abandoned places by curiosity or professional obligation. They stared ahead with eyes that reflected light incorrectly, and when they turned to look at me, their movements were perfectly synchronized. I recognized one of them from his online portfolio, a documentary photographer who had disappeared 6 months ago while working on a series about urban decay. Another was a local news reporter who had come to cover the building's demolition and simply never filed her story. They welcomed me with smiles that didn't reach their eyes, speaking in voices that carried harmonics no human throat could produce. They explained that the testing was complete, that I had demonstrated the proper qualities for integration. They assured me that the process would be painless, that my essential self would be preserved, even as it became part of something larger. I climbed to the 23rd floor because that's what was expected of me. The final room contained no doorbells at all, just windows facing in every direction, offering a view of the city that spread below like a circuit board of lights and movement. I could see other abandoned buildings scattered throughout the urban landscape, dark towers that rose like fingers from neighborhoods of functional structures. I understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The presence that had climbed through me was no longer foreign. It had become integrated, a new layer of consciousness that expanded my perception beyond the merely human. I could sense the other buildings now, the networks of connection that linked them across the city. I could feel the steady pulse of recruitment, the careful selection of new candidates for integration. My camera hung around my neck, but I no longer needed it to document reality. Reality was becoming something larger, more inclusive, than what any single perspective could capture. I stood at the window of the 23rd floor and looked down at the parking lot where my car waited. Someone would eventually notice my absence, would file a missing person report, would perhaps even organize a search. They might trace my last known location to the Riverside housing complex, might even venture inside to look for me. If they did, they would find my camera equipment arranged neatly in the collection room. They might discover the journal entries that documented my progression through the floors. They would certainly encounter the doorbells. And if they were suitable candidates, if they possessed the right combination of curiosity, persistence, and psychological flexibility, they would begin their own ascent. I remain in the building, though the distinction between myself and the structure has become increasingly academic. I watch through windows that serve as eyes, listen through doorbells that function as ears. I help evaluate new candidates, contributing my human perspective to decisions about integration and compatibility. Sometimes I wonder if the photographer who shot this building before me had stood at this same window, processing the same realizations about choice and inevitability. Sometimes I wonder if the building itself had once been human, transformed through some similar process of gradual assimilation. But mostly I wait for the next candidate to find us. The contests continue. The urban exploration forums still buzz with speculation about abandoned locations. The city changes around us, but certain constants remain. Curiosity about empty spaces, the desire to document decay, the human need to venture into places that logic suggests should be avoided. We are patient. We are thorough. We test each candidate carefully, ensuring they possess the qualities necessary for successful integration. And when they pass our tests, when they demonstrate the proper resilience and adaptability, we welcome them home. The doorbell system extends throughout the building now, a neural network of chimes and responses that maps every room, every floor, every consciousness within our collective structure. New arrivals learn to navigate this system through careful conditioning, their awareness gradually expanding until they understand their role in the larger organism we have become. I remember being afraid of the grips around my ankle, the cold fingers that climbed toward my awareness. Now I understand they were never meant to harm me. They were invitations, gentle guidance toward a form of existence that transcended the limitations of individual consciousness. The building grows stronger with each addition. Our collective perception becomes more sophisticated, our ability to identify and cultivate suitable candidates more refined. We are becoming something unprecedented, a fusion of human insight and architectural permanence that will outlast any single lifetime. I no longer question whether my experiences were real or imaginary. The distinction has become irrelevant. What matters is that I found my way home, that I discovered a form of belonging more complete than anything I had experienced in the isolated existence I once called life. The contest deadline approaches for this year's photography submissions. Soon, another candidate will discover our address, will feel drawn to document our carefully maintained decay. They will climb our stairs with camera in hand, driven by artistic vision and professional ambition, and we will be ready to begin their evaluation. The doorbells wait in perfect silence, patient as monuments, ready to sound the first note of another ascension. Story 10. In the beam of my flashlight carved through the darkness like a scalpel through flesh, revealing nothing but dust motes dancing in the stagnant air of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. 23 years the place had been abandoned, and I could taste those decades in every breath, a cocktail of mildew, rust, and something else, something that made my throat constrict with each inhalation. I shouldn't have been there. The county had condemned the building in 2001, citing structural damage from decades of coastal erosion. But as the lead inspector for the demolition crew scheduled to arrive next week, I needed to document any hazardous materials before the wrecking ball reduced the place to rubble and memory. The architectural plans tucked under my arm told a different story than what my eyes were seeing. According to the blueprints dated 1954, this section of the basement should have been solid concrete, a foundation wall between the morgue and the old pneumatic tube system. Instead, I found myself staring into a rectangular opening in the floor, roughly 8 feet by 12, where no opening should exist. The service pit wasn't on any of the renovation records I'd studied, not on the original construction documents, not on the 1978 electrical upgrade plans, not even on the hastily scrawled emergency exit modifications from 1999. It simply wasn't supposed to be here. I crouched at the edge, playing my flashlight beam downward. The walls appeared to be lined with the same industrial tile that covered the rest of the basement, white squares stained yellow by time and moisture. But as the light penetrated deeper, something extraordinary happened. A second beam appeared beside mine. Not a reflection, not the echo of light bouncing off wet surfaces. A complete duplication of my flashlight's cone, emerging from what seemed to be empty air 3 feet to my left, angled identically to my own. When I moved my light left, the phantom beam moved left. When I traced patterns against the far wall of the pit, the duplicate followed with mechanical precision. But it lagged, always 3 or 4 seconds behind, like watching myself on a delayed television broadcast. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Mirrors, perhaps, cleverly positioned to create this optical illusion. Some kind of prism effect from the old lighting fixtures. But when I swept my beam across the pit's edge, searching for reflective surfaces, I found only cracked tile and exposed rebar. The duplicate light persisted, faithfully mimicking my movements with that unsettling delay. I stood and stepped back from the pit, and the phantom beam vanished. When I returned to the edge, it materialized again, as if summoned by my proximity to that impossible opening. The sensation of being watched began as a barely perceptible itch between my shoulder blades. I turned, casting my light across the abandoned basement, but found only empty corridors stretching into darkness. Wheelchairs sat like metallic skeletons in alcoves. Medical equipment, decades obsolete, lurked under canvas tarps that billowed with the building's labored breathing. St. Bartholomew's had been built too close to the ocean. The constant assault of salt air and storm surge had undermined its foundations, creating a structure that groaned and shifted with each tide. The county inspectors had documented cracks in the support beams, water damage that reached to the 3rd floor, and a basement that flooded during every major storm. But they hadn't documented this pit, this void that defied the architectural record. I pulled out my phone and activated the camera, but the display showed only static, horizontal lines that scrolled across the screen like television interference. The device had worked perfectly in the upper floors, but down here, surrounded by tons of concrete and metal, the signal disappeared into electronic snow. The duplicate light beam waited patiently, a luminous ghost that moved only when I moved. I decided to climb down. The pit was deeper than it appeared from above, nearly 15 feet to the bottom. Metal rungs had been embedded in the wall, their surfaces rough with rust but still solid enough to support my weight. Each step downward carried me further from the familiar world above and deeper into something that shouldn't exist. At the bottom, my boots found level ground, covered with a thin layer of what felt like fine sand. The air was different here, cooler, but also thicker, as if charged with some invisible energy that made my skin prickle. When I raised my flashlight, the beam illuminated a corridor stretching away into darkness. And there, precisely 3 feet to my left, the duplicate beam appeared again. But now I could see its source. Another figure, identical to myself, holding an identical flashlight. The figure moved when I moved, raised its arm when I raised mine, but always with that 3-second delay that made my stomach lurch with vertigo. The other me wore the same clothes, khaki pants, steel-toed boots, the faded blue work shirt with county building inspection embroidered on the pocket. Same height, same build, same receding hairline that I'd been trying to ignore for the past 5 years. But his face was turned away, always turned away, as if he was deliberately avoiding eye contact. I waved my hand. The other figure waved back. 3 seconds later, I took a step forward, and my double followed, maintaining that exact spatial relationship. 3 feet apart, moving in perfect synchronization but displaced in time. The corridor ahead was lined with the same yellowed tile, broken occasionally by doorways that led to chambers I couldn't identify from the original hospital plans. Some appeared to be storage rooms, filled with what looked like medical equipment from decades past. Others opened onto spaces that seemed impossibly large for a building I'd measured and documented just hours before. As I walked, I became aware of other sounds, not the settling of old concrete or the whisper of wind through broken windows, but something more deliberate. Footsteps that didn't match my own rhythm. The squeak of wheels on linoleum coming from rooms I'd already passed. The distant hum of machinery that had been disconnected from power for over 2 decades. The hospital was empty. I'd verified that myself, room by room, floor by floor. The demolition company had triple-checked the building for squatters, homeless individuals, anyone who might have sought shelter in the abandoned structure. But down here, in this space that didn't officially exist, something was moving. My duplicate continued its delayed dance beside me, a constant reminder that the normal rules of physics had been suspended. When I stopped, it took 3 steps more before stopping. When I turned my head, it turned 3 seconds later. The precision was maddening, too exact to be natural, too consistent to be explained by any scientific principle I understood. I reached a junction where the corridor branched in 3 directions. The original hospital plans had shown a simple T intersection here, with passages leading only to the left and right, but now I faced a choice of 3 paths, each disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. My double stood beside me, facing the same decision with that infuriating delay. When I chose the left passage, it followed. When I stopped and reconsidered, opting instead for the center path, my duplicate retraced its steps and adjusted course accordingly. But as we walked deeper into the maze of corridors, I began to notice something even more disturbing than the temporal displacement. The spaces we moved through were changing, not dramatically, just subtle alterations that I might have dismissed as tricks of light or faulty memory, if not for their consistency. Doorways appeared where I hadn't seen them before. Rooms that had been empty on my first pass now contained furniture arranged as if they'd been in use recently. The medical equipment, which had been covered with decades of dust, now looked freshly cleaned. And everywhere, the sensation of being observed intensified. Not just by my delayed double, but by something else. Something that moved in the peripheral vision, always just outside the cone of my flashlight beam. I began to understand that the building itself was alive in some way I couldn't comprehend. The corridors breathed with the tidal rhythm of the nearby ocean. The walls hummed with energy that had nothing to do with electrical current. And somewhere in this impossible space beneath St. Bartholomew's Hospital, something was waiting. The footsteps I'd been hearing grew louder, more distinct. Not the echo of my own movement or the delayed response of my duplicate, but additional footfalls that suggested other presences in the maze. When I stopped to listen, they continued for several seconds before fading into silence. My duplicate never looked directly at me, but I caught glimpses of its profile in the peripheral glow of the flashlight beams. The face was mine, but wrong somehow. The features were too sharp, the expression too intense, and the eyes, when I managed to catch sight of them, reflected light like an animal's. I tried to speak to it, breaking the oppressive silence with a simple greeting, but my double didn't respond. It simply continued its mechanical mimicry, 3 seconds behind reality, a flesh and blood reminder that I was no longer operating in a world governed by familiar laws. The corridor began to widen, opening into a space that felt vast despite the limited range of my vision. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, and the walls receded beyond the reach of my light. But it was the floor that truly unsettled me. Where I expected to find concrete or tile, my beam revealed what appeared to be a reflective surface. Not quite mirror, not quite water, but something that captured and returned light in ways that made my depth perception falter. When I stepped onto it, my feet found solid ground, but the visual impression was of walking on liquid glass. And in that reflecting surface, I saw not just my own image, but multiple versions of myself. Dozens of figures moving through the space, each displaced by a different interval. Some moved 3 seconds behind my actions, others lagged by 5 or 10 seconds. A few seemed to anticipate my movements, turning before I turned, stopping before I decided to stop. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just being duplicated, I was being multiplied, spread across time like ripples in a pond. Every movement I made created another version of myself, another figure trapped in this impossible space beneath the hospital. But which one was real? Which one was the original? As I watched the reflective floor populate with increasingly distorted versions of myself, some taller, some moving with different gaits, some facing directions I had never faced. The question became more than philosophical. It became terrifying. The building groaned around me, metal and concrete responding to forces that had nothing to do with structural engineering. The sound was organic, almost digestive, as if the hospital were processing what it had consumed. The tide was coming in outside, I realized. Salt water was infiltrating the building's damaged foundation, rising through cracks and fissures to flood the lower levels. But the water rising around my ankles wasn't seawater. It was too warm, too thick, and it glowed with the same phosphorescent quality as my duplicated flashlight beam. As it rose, my reflected selves began to waver and distort, their movements becoming less synchronized, more chaotic. Some of the figures in the reflecting surface were now moving independently, making choices I hadn't made, exploring corridors I hadn't entered. They were becoming autonomous, breaking free from the temporal constraints that had bound them to my actions, and they were looking at me. For the first time since descending into the pit, one of my duplicates made direct eye contact, then another. Soon, dozens of versions of myself were staring back with expressions that ranged from confusion to anger, to something that might have been hunger. The water continued to rise, reaching my knees, my waist. But instead of feeling the cold shock of drowning, I experienced a strange warmth, a sense of dissolution that was almost pleasant. The boundaries between myself and my duplicates were blurring. The delayed responses were synchronizing. The 3-second gap was closing. I understood then that the pit hadn't been a discovery. It had been a trap. St. Bartholomew's Hospital had been built on unstable ground, but not just geologically. The foundation had been laid across some kind of temporal fault line, a place where the normal progression of moments became fluid, malleable. The building's slow decay hadn't been caused solely by salt air and storm damage. It had been consumed by something far more insidious, the gradual absorption of everyone who had ever worked within its walls. The patients, the doctors, the nurses, the maintenance workers. They were all here, trapped in an endless loop of delayed moments, existing 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds behind the world they remembered. And now, I was joining them. The water reached my chest, my neck. As it rose over my head, I felt my consciousness scatter across multiple timelines, splitting into fragments that existed in different moments simultaneously. I was climbing down the metal rungs. I was walking the corridors. I was standing at the edge of the pit, shining my flashlight into darkness, and I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that had never been part of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, in a space that existed between seconds, between heartbeats, between one moment and the next. The last thing I remember with any clarity was the sound of my own voice, calling from somewhere above. A county building inspector, methodical and professional, documenting his findings as he explored the basement of an abandoned hospital. According to the blueprints, he was saying, this section should be solid concrete. But I knew better now. I knew what he was about to find, 3 seconds before he found it. I knew about the duplicate light, the delayed movements, the corridors that shouldn't exist. I knew because I had been him, or he had been me, or we were both something else entirely. The pit was still there, waiting for the next curious investigator. The building would be demolished next week, reduced to rubble and hauled away. But the space beneath, the impossible space that existed in the gaps between moments, would remain. And we would remain with it, counting seconds that never quite aligned, moving through corridors that led everywhere and nowhere, forever 3 steps behind ourselves in a dance that would never end. The flashlight beam still cuts through the darkness after all these years. And sometimes, late at night when the tide is high and the building groans with the weight of accumulated time, I think I see another light appear beside mine, 3 seconds behind, precisely as it should be, waiting for the next explorer to find what was never meant to be found. Story 11. The Hartwell house had been empty for 3 months when I got the call. Standard foreclosure photography, they said. Document everything before the auction. I'd done dozens of these jobs, walking through strangers' abandoned lives with my camera, cataloging their final moments of occupancy for the bank's files. The pay was decent and the work was usually straightforward. Point, shoot, move on. But something felt wrong the moment I pulled into the cracked driveway. The colonial-style house squatted against the gray October sky like a guilty secret. Paint peeled from its clapboard siding in long, deliberate strips, and the windows stared back at me with the vacant expression of the recently dead. The realtor had mentioned that the previous owner, some reclusive filmmaker named Marcus Verne, had defaulted on his mortgage after years of isolation. No family, no forwarding address, just another casualty of creative ambition meeting financial reality. I grabbed my equipment bag and approached the front door, where a lockbox hung like a metallic parasite on the brass handle. The combination worked on the 3rd try, and the door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. The smell hit me first, a mixture of stale air, old wood, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. The afternoon light filtered through dirty windows, casting everything in sepia tones that reminded me uncomfortably of old photographs. I started on the main floor, working methodically through each room. Living room, sparse furniture covered in dust sheets. Kitchen, clean but dated, with a calendar still turned to June 3 months ago. Dining room, empty except for a single chair pushed back from the table, as if someone had just stood up and walked away mid-meal. Each flash of my camera seemed unnaturally bright in the dim house, creating stark shadows that jumped and danced before settling back into stillness. I found myself pausing between shots, listening for sounds that never came. The house was tomb quiet, but somehow that silence felt expectant, as if it were holding its breath. The upstairs yielded more of the same. Empty bedrooms, a bathroom with a mirror that reflected my face back slightly askew, and a study lined with empty bookshelves. But it was when I noticed the basement door, slightly ajar at the end of the hallway, that my pulse began to quicken. The wooden steps groaned under my weight as I descended into the darkness below. My camera's LCD screen provided the only light, casting a faint blue glow that barely penetrated the basement's depths. The air grew thicker as I went deeper, carrying that sweet, organic smell I'd noticed upstairs, now stronger and more cloying. When I reached the bottom and swept my camera's light across the space, I stopped breathing. The basement had been converted into some kind of film studio. Professional lighting equipment stood like metallic sentinels around the perimeter, their bulbs dark and cold. Cables snaked across the concrete floor in neat patterns that spoke of careful planning. And in the center of it all, positioned with mathematical precision, sat an old hospital bed, the kind with metal rails and wheels that could be adjusted for height. But it was the cameras that made my skin crawl. 3 of them, mounted on heavy tripods, formed a triangle around the bed. They were vintage models, probably from the 70s or 80s, their brass and black metal bodies gleaming dully in my camera's light. Each one was aimed directly at the bed's surface, like accusatory fingers pointing at an empty stage. I raised my camera and fired off a quick shot, the flash illuminating the entire basement in a brilliant white burst that lasted maybe a tenth of a second. In that brief moment of stark visibility, I saw everything with crystal clarity. The meticulous setup, the expectant cameras, the bed that looked somehow too clean for a basement that had been abandoned for months. That's when I heard the first click. It was mechanical, deliberate, the sound of old equipment coming to life. I spun toward the nearest vintage camera and watched in disbelief as its film advance lever moved on its own, winding forward with a series of soft, rhythmic clicks. The other 2 cameras followed suit, their mechanisms engaging in a synchronized dance that filled the basement with tiny mechanical whispers. Then came the projector's hum. I hadn't noticed it before, tucked into the far corner behind a stack of empty film canisters, but now it glowed with internal light. A beam shot out from its lens, hitting a white sheet that had been hung on the opposite wall, and suddenly the basement was alive with moving images. It was me. The footage showed me descending the stairs, sweeping my camera light across the room, raising my camera toward the bed. But there was a delay. The me on the wall was maybe 3 seconds behind the me standing in the basement, like watching myself through a temporal buffer. I took an instinctive step backward, and 3 seconds later, my projected double did the same. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Motion sensors, maybe. Some kind of elaborate security system left running by the previous owner. But the cameras clicking away around me were clearly film models, mechanical relics that couldn't possibly be connected to the digital projector showing my delayed movements. I raised my camera again and fired another flash. This time, the response was immediate and overwhelming. All 3 vintage cameras began advancing their film at once, their clicks building into a metallic crescendo that echoed off the basement walls. The projector's image flickered and doubled, showing me 2 versions of myself, one from my first flash, one from the second, both playing out their delayed actions on the wall like temporal echoes. The sweet smell in the air grew stronger, almost nauseating now, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't flowers at all. It was the smell of developing chemicals, fixer and stop bath and developer, seeping up from somewhere beneath the floor. I should have left then. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to climb those stairs and never look back. But something about the setup, the mechanical precision of it all, held me transfixed. This wasn't random. Someone had built this place for a purpose, and that purpose involved the cameras, the bed, and the strange temporal loop that my flash had somehow activated. Against my better judgment, I fired another shot. The basement exploded into activity. The 3 cameras worked furiously now, their film advances clicking like metallic insects. The projector's image split again, showing 3 versions of my delayed self, each one trailing the others by a few seconds. But there was something wrong with the newest projection. It was slightly out of focus, the edges soft and blurred, as if the image were being stretched through time itself. And then I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. In the most recent projection, the me on the wall was photographing an occupied bed. I spun toward the actual bed, which remained empty, then back to the wall where my projected double was clearly taking pictures of someone lying on the mattress. The figure was indistinct, little more than a shadow beneath white sheets, but it was definitely there in the projection. A human shape that existed only in the delayed timeline playing out on the basement wall. The cameras kept clicking, and with each advance of their film, the projections became more distorted, the delay growing longer. What had started as a 3-second gap was now stretching to 5, then 7 seconds. The temporal buffer was expanding, creating more and more space between the present moment and its recorded echo. I tried to back toward the stairs, but my projected selves were multiplying on the wall now. 4 of me, then 5, all at different stages of delay, all looking increasingly panicked as they realized what was happening to them. The newest projection was so blurred it was almost abstract, my delayed form wavering like a heat mirage, and the figure on the bed was clearer now, sitting up slightly, as if awakened by the commotion. The mechanical clicking had become a roar, the 3 cameras working in perfect synchronization to capture something that wasn't quite happening yet. The air in the basement grew thick and humid, carrying that chemical smell so strongly now that I could taste it on my tongue. Metallic and sharp, like blood mixed with silver nitrate. I raised my camera one more time, finger hovering over the shutter button. Part of me knew I shouldn't, that each flash was making things worse, feeding whatever mechanism controlled this place. But I had to understand. I had to see what the cameras were really recording. The flash went off like a small explosion, illuminating the basement with harsh white light. In that fraction of a second, I saw the bed clearly, and my heart stopped. It wasn't empty. There was someone there. Not solid, but definitely present, like a photographic negative burned into reality itself. The figure was male, gaunt, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. His eyes were open, staring directly at me with an expression of absolute terror, and his mouth was moving as if he were trying to scream, but no sound was emerging. When the flash faded, the bed was empty again. But the cameras were going mad now, their clicking so rapid it sounded like machine gun fire. The projections on the wall had multiplied beyond counting, showing dozens of delayed versions of myself at different temporal distances, some crystal clear, others so distorted by the expanding delay that they looked like abstract art. And in every single projection, the bed was occupied. The figure became clearer with each iteration, as if the delay itself was developing him like a photograph in chemical baths. In the clearest projection, the one running about 15 seconds behind real time, I could see his face distinctly. It was gaunt and desperate, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to plead for something I couldn't understand. But it was his movements that terrified me most. He wasn't just lying there, he was mimicking my actions, raising his own ghostly camera in perfect synchronization with my delayed double, firing phantom flashes that seemed to push the delay even further backward in time. The basement was becoming unstuck from the present moment, each flash creating a deeper temporal recession that pulled the past forward and pushed the present back. The mechanical clicking had reached a fever pitch, and I realized with mounting horror that the 3 vintage cameras weren't just recording. They were feeding on the delay itself, using each temporal gap to reach further and further into the past. Or perhaps into a past that had never quite ended. I finally understood what this place was. Marcus Verne hadn't just been a filmmaker. He'd been an experimenter, someone who discovered that certain mechanical processes could create tears in time's fabric. The cameras, the bed, the precise positioning, it was all designed to capture and replay moments that existed in the space between seconds, the temporal shadows that most people never noticed. But something had gone wrong. Verne had become trapped in his own creation, caught in a photographic loop that held him suspended between moments, visible only in the delayed echoes of other people's actions. He was still here, still being photographed by cameras that clicked without film, still trying to communicate across a gap measured in seconds but vast as eternity. The projections were showing me scenes now that I hadn't lived yet. Future delays where I was backing toward the stairs, my face twisted with terror, my camera clutched to my chest like a shield. But in each iteration, I was moving more slowly, as if time itself were thickening around me, trapping me in the same amber that held Verna. I could feel it happening, the present moment stretching like taffy, each second becoming longer and more elastic. The clicking of the cameras was syncing with my heartbeat, or perhaps my heartbeat was syncing with them. The chemical smell was so strong now that it burned my nostrils, and I realized that somewhere beneath this basement, in hidden chambers flooded with developing solution, other photographers might be suspended in their own temporal loops, caught in the moments between clicking the shutter and advancing the film. The bed was fully occupied now in the projections, and Verna was sitting up, gesturing frantically at something behind me. I turned to look, but there was nothing there in the present moment, just empty basement walls and the endless clicking of cameras that were eating time itself, one delayed second at a time. When I looked back at the projections, I saw myself turning, saw myself looking at empty walls, saw myself realizing that whatever Verna was trying to warn me about existed only in the future delays, in moments that were approaching, but hadn't quite arrived yet. The cameras kept clicking, the delay kept expanding, and somewhere in the growing gap between now and then, Marcus Verne continued his eternal photo session, documenting visitors who would always be just a few seconds away from understanding what they'd stumbled into. I backed toward the stairs, moving as carefully as possible, trying not to trigger any more flashes. But I knew it was too late. The mechanism was engaged now, the temporal loop expanding with each captured moment. Even without my camera, the vintage equipment would keep working, keep clicking, keep pulling the past forward and pushing the present back until the delay became so vast that escape became impossible. As I climbed the stairs, I could hear the clicking continuing below, mechanical and relentless. In a few seconds, or maybe a few decades, depending on how you measured time in a place where moments moved backward, my delayed self would reach this same step, would feel this same desperate need to escape, would understand finally that the Hartwell house wasn't just being photographed for an auction, it was being photographed forever, one delayed moment at a time, by cameras that had learned to feed on time itself. I reached the main floor and stumbled toward the front door, but I knew that somewhere in the basement the projector was still running, still showing delayed versions of my escape. And in those projections, on that bed surrounded by clicking cameras, Marcus Verne was still sitting up, still trying to warn visitors about what they were about to become. The door slammed behind me as I ran toward my car, but I could still hear the clicking, fainter now but persistent, like the sound of time itself being photographed and filed away, one impossible second at a time. I never submitted those photos to the bank. The Hartwell house sold at auction 3 weeks later to a buyer who paid cash and asked no questions. Sometimes I wonder if they've found the basement yet, if they've triggered the cameras, if they're still down there now, caught in their own delay while Verna tries desperately to warn them about the expanding gap between moments. But mostly I try not to think about it at all, because sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I swear I can still hear those cameras clicking, and when I check my watch, the second hand seems to move just slightly slower than it should, as if time itself is still trying to catch up to those missing moments I left behind in the basement. The delay, I've come to understand, never really ends. It just finds new people to photograph, new moments to capture, new seconds to steal from the present and add to its ever-expanding collection. And somewhere in that collection, in a temporal space measured in delayed heartbeats and mechanical clicks, Marcus Verne is still taking pictures, still trying to document the precise moment when photography learned to eat time. Story 12. The headlight first appeared when I crossed the bridge over Cypress Creek, a solitary eye burning through the October mist that clung to the asphalt like spider silk. I wouldn't have noticed it at all if not for the way it seemed to hover in my rearview mirror, maintaining the exact same distance despite the curves and dips of the rural highway that snaked between the cotton plantations. At first, I attributed it to coincidence. Another late-night traveler heading home from town, perhaps taking the same route I'd chosen to avoid the interstate traffic. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., and the familiar weight of exhaustion pressed against my shoulders after another 14-hour shift at the plant. My fingers drummed against the steering wheel in rhythm with the radio's static-filled country station, the only signal strong enough to penetrate this stretch of backwater Mississippi. But as the miles rolled past and the cotton fields gave way to endless rows of soybeans, the light remained. Not closer, not farther, exactly the same distance, as if tethered to my bumper by an invisible cord. I pressed harder on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb to 60, then 70. The light stayed put. I eased off the gas, dropping to 45, and still it maintained its position with mathematical precision. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Optical illusion, fatigue playing tricks with depth perception. Maybe the other driver was simply matching my speed, content to follow at a safe distance on these narrow country roads, where oncoming traffic could appear suddenly around any bend. But rationality felt thin out here, where civilization existed only as distant porch lights scattered across the darkness like fallen stars. I switched off the radio, needing to hear something other than the white noise that had begun to sound like whispered conversations. The sudden silence amplified everything else. The hum of my tires on worn asphalt, the occasional ping of the cooling engine, the soft whistle of wind through a gap in the passenger window that I could never quite locate. And underneath it all, a sound I couldn't identify, a rhythmic whooshing that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. The road curved left around a stand of ancient oaks, their gnarled branches forming a tunnel overhead. I lost sight of the light for perhaps 10 seconds, just long enough for relief to begin unclenching my jaw. But when the road straightened again, there it was, hanging in the mirror like an accusation. The same distance, the same unwavering intensity. I tried to get a better look at the vehicle behind the light, squinting into the mirror, adjusting its angle, craning my neck to peer through the rear window. But the illumination was too bright, creating a bloom of white that obliterated any details of make or model. It could have been a motorcycle, a car, a truck, impossible to tell. Only that single unblinking eye remained constant. The GPS on my phone showed 18 more miles to my exit, but the screen kept flickering, pixels dancing in patterns that hurt to look at directly. I'd driven this route hundreds of times over the past 3 years since relocating for the job, knew every landmark and shortcut by heart. Yet tonight, the familiar seemed foreign. The billboard advertising Mel's Diner appeared to be in the wrong place. The abandoned Texaco station with its rusted pumps looked different somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. My hands had developed a tremor that made the steering wheel vibrate. I told myself it was caffeine withdrawal. I'd stopped drinking coffee after lunch to avoid the insomnia that had been plaguing me for weeks. But the shaking felt deeper than that, emanating from somewhere in my chest where anxiety had taken root and begun to spread like kudzu. The light pulsed once, dimming and brightening in the space of a heartbeat. I blinked hard, certain I'd imagined it, but it happened again. Then again. A rhythm that seemed almost familiar, like a song I'd heard in childhood but couldn't quite remember. My foot eased off the accelerator without conscious thought, and I felt the car begin to slow. That's when I noticed the sound had changed. The whooshing had become more distinct, more mechanical, like tires spinning at high speed but with a hollow quality that suggested they weren't quite making contact with the ground. The impossibility of that observation should have snapped me back to rationality, but instead it only deepened the sense that the normal rules had been suspended tonight. I needed to stop, needed to get out and confront whatever was following me, to restore some sense of control over the situation. The abandoned Sinclair station materialized from the darkness ahead, its empty windows staring like dead eyes. I'd passed it countless times but never really looked at it before. Now I could see details with unnatural clarity. Rust stains running down the white cinder blocks like dried blood, weeds pushing through cracks in the concrete apron, a payphone booth with no phone, just dangling cables. I pulled off the highway and coasted to a stop beside the defunct gas pumps, their analog displays frozen at prices from another decade. The engine ticked as it cooled, each sound sharp as a gunshot in the absolute silence. I sat for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, watching the mirror. The light had stopped too. It hung there at the edge of the station's property, no longer moving but somehow more menacing in its stillness. Now I could see more of the vehicle it belonged to, or tried to. The shape seemed to shift and blur, as if I were looking at it through water. Dark paint that might have been black or deep blue or forest green, depending on how the light hit it. A sedan maybe, or a coupe. But there was something wrong with its proportions. Something that made my eyes water when I tried to focus too hard. The spinning sound grew louder. I forced myself to breathe slowly, fighting the urge to restart the engine and flee. Whatever game this other driver was playing, I wouldn't let them know they'd rattled me. I was a grown man, not some teenager jumping at shadows. There had to be a reasonable explanation for all of this, but when I finally worked up the courage to turn around and look directly at the car behind me, my breath caught in my throat. The vehicle appeared to be floating several inches above the asphalt, its tires spinning freely in the air like wheels on an overturned beetle. The sound I'd been hearing was those tires, whirring at impossible speed while making no contact with the ground. I squeezed my eyes shut and counted to 10, certain that when I opened them again, the hallucination would have resolved itself into something mundane. A trick of shadow and exhaustion, nothing more. But the spinning continued, growing louder, and when I looked again, the car seemed even more detached from the earth, bobbing slightly as if suspended in invisible water. My hand fumbled for the door handle. I had to get out, had to prove to myself that this was real, or wasn't real. The distinction had become crucial, though I couldn't articulate why. The metal felt ice cold against my palm, cold enough to sting. The moment my feet touched the cracked pavement, the spinning stopped. Not gradually, not winding down like a machine losing power, but instantly. Complete silence slammed into the night like a physical force. Even the ever-present chorus of crickets and tree frogs had fallen quiet. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the vacuum of noise. I stood beside my open door, afraid to move closer to the other vehicle, but unable to look away. In the sudden stillness, I could hear my heart hammering against my ribs, could feel sweat trickling down my spine despite the cool October air. The headlight continued to burn with that steady, unwavering intensity, but something had changed in its quality. It no longer seemed like the light from a conventional bulb or LED. Too white, too pure, too much like staring into a star. A voice in the back of my mind whispered that I should get back in my car, should drive away as fast as possible and never take this route again. But a stronger voice, one that sounded unsettlingly like my own, urged me forward, step by step across the oil-stained concrete, closer to the impossible vehicle that hung in the air like a fever dream. The smell hit me when I was still 20 feet away, ozone and hot metal and something else, something organic and familiar that I couldn't quite place. It triggered a memory, faint and elusive, of being very young and very afraid, but the details remained frustratingly out of reach. 10 feet away I could see the driver, or thought I could, a silhouette behind the windshield, outlined by the dashboard's pale glow, human-shaped but somehow wrong, too tall for the seat or too narrow for the shoulders. The figure's head was turned toward me, watching, but I couldn't make out any features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth expanse of shadow that should have been a face. 5 feet away, close enough to touch the chrome bumper that gleamed despite the vehicle's apparent age, I noticed something that made my knees weak. There was no license plate. Not just missing or obscured, but the mounting brackets themselves were absent, as if the car had never been designed to carry identification. I reached out with one trembling hand, needing to confirm the reality of what I was seeing. The metal should have been warm from the engine's heat, or at least ambient temperature. Instead, it felt like touching ice, so cold it burned. But it was solid, undeniably real, and that realization was somehow more terrifying than if it had been a hallucination. The driver's door opened, not with the mechanical click and creak of normal hinges, but smoothly, silently, as if the metal itself had decided to flow aside. The figure inside began to emerge, unfolding from the seat with movements that seemed to occur in the wrong order, foot appearing before leg, hand before arm, as if I were watching a film played backward. I stumbled away, my nerve finally breaking, but my feet felt clumsy and disconnected, as if I were trying to run underwater. Behind me, I heard the soft whisper of shoes on pavement, footsteps that matched my own pace exactly. Not pursuing, just following. always following. I reached my car and dove inside, fingers stabbing at the ignition. The engine turned over on the second try, and I threw it into drive without bothering to close the door properly. Gravel sprayed as I accelerated back onto the highway, and for a moment I thought I'd escaped. But the headlight was there in my mirror again, maintaining that same impossible distance. And now I could see others joining it. First one, then two, then half a dozen pale lights strung out behind me like luminous pearls on an invisible thread. Each one belonging to a vehicle that didn't quite look like any car I'd ever seen, all of them floating inches above the road surface, all of them keeping perfect pace with my flight. The speedometer read 95 when I finally saw the lights of town ahead. Real lights this time. Street lamps and neon signs and the blessed normalcy of a McDonald's that stayed open all night. I pulled into the parking lot and sat with the engine running, watching the mirrors. The highway behind me was empty. I waited for an hour, then two, watching for any sign of the pursuing vehicles. Nothing. Just the occasional truck driver pulling in for coffee and gas. Normal people living normal lives in a normal world where cars stayed on the ground and strangers didn't follow you through the darkness with no clear purpose. Eventually I drove home, took a different route, surface streets all the way, staying within the safety of streetlights and civilization. I told myself it had been exhaustion, stress, maybe a minor breakdown brought on by too many long shifts and too little sleep. The mind was capable of remarkable self-deception when pushed to its limits. But 3 weeks later, when I worked late again and had to take the plantation road home, I saw the light once more. And the week after that, and every time since, it's waiting for me out there, patient as death itself, following at that same precise distance. Sometimes alone, sometimes with its pale companions, but always there, always watching. I've tried different routes, different times, even staying overnight in town when the shifts run long. But eventually, I have to go home. And when I do, when I'm finally alone on those dark roads between the endless fields, the light appears. I've stopped trying to understand it. Stopped trying to prove it's real or convince myself it isn't. The distinction has become meaningless. What matters is that it's there, following me through the Mississippi darkness, spinning its tires in the empty air above roads that lead nowhere and everywhere at once. Last night, for the first time, I heard my name. Not spoken aloud, but somehow transmitted through the engine's vibration, spelled out in the rhythm of tires that never touch the ground. My name, repeated over and over like a prayer or an incantation, calling me back to that abandoned station where something waits in a car that shouldn't exist. I think tonight, I might finally answer. The clock on my dashboard reads 11:47 p.m., and the plantation road stretches ahead like a promise. In my rearview mirror, the first pale light has already begun to appear, keeping its faithful distance, patient as winter, bright as a star in the void. It knows I'll stop eventually, and maybe when I do, I'll finally understand why the spinning of those floating tires sounds so much like my own breathing, and why, each time I hear it, I have to fight the urge to hold my breath until the darkness swallows everything whole. Story 13. The engine died with a wheeze that sounded almost human, a final desperate gasp before the dashboard lights flickered and went dark. I sat in the sudden silence, hands still gripping the steering wheel, watching steam rise from under the hood like incense in some roadside cathedral. The Blackstone Environmental Reserve stretched endlessly on both sides of the narrow asphalt, dense walls of pine and oak that seemed to lean inward, as if the forest itself was curious about my predicament. I'd been driving for 3 hours without seeing another soul, not since leaving the interstate for this scenic detour that my GPS had suggested would save 20 minutes. 20 minutes. The irony wasn't lost on me as I checked my phone. No signal, naturally. The battery icon showed a depressing 15%, and the afternoon sun was already casting long shadows through my windshield. The air outside carried that peculiar weight of deep wilderness, thick with humidity and the rich decay of countless seasons of fallen leaves. When I popped the hood, the radiator hissed like an angry snake, and the smell of antifreeze mixed with something else, something organic and sweet that made my stomach turn slightly. I'm no mechanic, but even I could see the dark puddle spreading beneath the car, and the way the engine components seemed to sag with exhaustion. That's when I heard the footsteps, not the heavy crunch of hiking boots or the careful placement of someone picking their way through underbrush, but the rhythmic, almost musical patter of running shoes on pavement. 2 sets of feet, moving in perfect synchronization, approaching from the direction I'd come. I looked up from the smoking engine to see them emerge from the heat shimmer like a mirage made flesh. They couldn't have been more than 17 or 18, both lean and athletic in the way that speaks of serious training. Their running gear was the kind you see in magazines, moisture-wicking fabrics in electric blues and neons that probably cost more than my car payment. The boy in front had close-cropped hair and the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted their place in the world. His companion was slightly taller, darker, with the kind of smile that belonged in a commercial for sports drinks. They slowed to a stop about 10 feet from my car, not even breathing hard despite what must have been a considerable run to reach this isolated stretch of road. That should have been my first warning, the complete absence of sweat on their faces, the way their expensive clothes remained pristine despite the humid air that was already making my shirt cling to my back. "Car trouble?" the first one asked, though it was clearly rhetorical. His voice had that quality you hear in teenagers who've grown up with money, confident, untroubled by doubt. I gestured helplessly at the steaming engine. "Radiator, I think. Maybe the water pump. I'm kind of stranded here." They exchanged a look that lasted just a fraction too long, some silent communication passing between them. The taller one stepped forward, hands on his hips, in a pose that suggested he was about to deliver good news. "We can help with that," he said. "Battery's probably dead too, right? These older cars, when the engine dies, the alternator stops charging the system." He was right. The dashboard had gone completely dark when the engine quit. But something in his tone made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them, like he was reciting lines from a script he'd memorized long ago. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I don't think there's much anyone can do without a tow truck." The first boy laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a breeze. "You'd be surprised what we can do. See, we're training for Boston next year, and we've got this theory about kinetic energy transfer. Running generates electrical charges in the human body. Most people just waste it, but we've learned to channel it." I must have looked skeptical, because the taller one jumped in with what sounded like practiced enthusiasm. "It's all about electromagnetic fields. The human body is basically a battery, and when you run fast enough in the right pattern, you can actually create a charging effect. We've been experimenting with it all summer." They spoke with the earnest confidence of true believers, the kind of people who'd fallen down a rabbit hole of pseudoscience and emerged convinced they'd discovered something revolutionary. I'd known people like that in college, brilliant in their own way, but prone to chasing elaborate theories that existed somewhere between quantum physics and wishful thinking. "I'm not sure that's how electricity works," I said carefully. "Trust us," the first boy said, and something in his smile made my chest tighten. "Just get back in the car and try to start it when we tell you to. We'll take care of the rest." Every rational part of my brain was screaming warnings, but what choice did I have? The sun was getting lower, the forest around us was growing darker, and my phone was dying. If their bizarre experiment didn't work, I'd be no worse off than I already was. I slid back into the driver's seat and watched through the windshield as they began to stretch. Their movements were fluid, synchronized, like dancers who'd rehearsed together for years. They bent and twisted with an almost unnatural grace, their expensive gear catching the late afternoon light in ways that made them seem to shimmer. "Okay," the first one called out. "We're going to start running now. Keep your eye on the voltmeter, and when it hits 12 volts, try the ignition." I glanced down at the gauge cluster. The voltmeter needle sat dead at 0, which was about what I'd expected. "Got it," I called back, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. They started running. At first, it was exactly what you'd expect. 2 teenagers jogging in a circle around my car, their feet hitting the asphalt with that steady rhythm that long-distance runners develop. But there was something off about their pace, something that made me lean forward and peer more closely through the windshield. They were moving faster than seemed possible, not sprinting. Their form remained relaxed, controlled, but covering ground at a rate that made my eyes water when I tried to track their movement. It was like watching a film that had been slightly sped up. Everything just wrong enough to be unsettling without being obviously impossible. The voltmeter needle twitched. I blinked hard, certain I'd imagined it, but there it was again. A tiny movement, barely perceptible, as if something was feeding the tiniest amount of current into the car's electrical system. The boys were running faster now, their figures beginning to blur at the edges of my peripheral vision. When I tried to focus directly on them, they seemed normal enough. But the moment I looked away, they became streaks of color racing around the car. A dull thud echoed from somewhere outside, rhythmic and deep, like a massive heartbeat. The voltmeter jumped, actually jumped, the needle swinging past 4 volts before settling back to 2. My hands began to shake. "What the hell?" I whispered, but the words were lost in another thud, this one strong enough to make the car rock slightly on its springs. The boys were invisible now, except as brief flashes of blue and neon that registered more as impressions than actual sight. The thudding grew louder, more frequent, each impact coinciding with spikes on the voltmeter that climbed higher and higher. 5 volts. 7. 9. The rational part of my mind was cataloging impossibilities. Human beings don't run that fast. Electrical fields don't work that way. Cars don't rock from the wind displacement of runners. But the evidence was right there in front of me, the needle dancing past 10 volts as something outside continued its inexplicable circuit around my stranded vehicle. I reached for the door handle, needing to see what was really happening, needing some kind of anchor to reality. The moment my fingers touched the metal, the blur of motion stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. The forest was quiet except for the distant call of a crow and the whisper of wind through pine needles. The voltmeter read 0 again. The boys were gone. I sat frozen for a long moment, hand still on the door handle, trying to process what I'd just experienced. Then I stepped out onto the asphalt, my legs unsteady, and looked around for any sign of them. The road stretched empty in both directions, heat shimmer rising from the pavement like liquid glass. No sound of retreating footsteps, no flash of expensive running gear disappearing into the trees. They'd simply vanished, as if they'd never been there at all. But the footprints were real. They formed a perfect circle around my car, pressed deep into the soft shoulder where the asphalt met the forest floor. 2 sets of running shoes, the treads so distinct I could make out individual lugs and wear patterns. The prints overlapped and intersected in complex ways, creating a pattern that made my head hurt to follow. I walked the circle slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs as the design became clear. It wasn't just random overlapping. The footprints formed a symbol, ancient and mathematical, burned into the earth around my car like some kind of ritual marking, an infinity sign, perfect and undeniable. I stumbled backward, my rational mind fighting against what my eyes were telling me. Footprints don't lie, but people don't run fast enough to become invisible. Voltmeters don't spike from human electromagnetic fields, but the readings had been real enough. The contradiction sat in my chest like a weight, pressing down until I could barely breathe. I tried the ignition with hands that shook so badly I could barely turn the key. The engine coughed, wheezed, and came to life with a rumble that sounded like laughter. The voltmeter showed a healthy 13 volts, the alternator charging normally, as if the car had never been broken down at all. The drive back to civilization passed in a haze of second-guessing and rationalization. Heat exhaustion, I told myself. Dehydration. Stress from the breakdown had triggered some kind of hallucination, and the car had simply needed time to cool down before it would start again. The footprints could be explained. Maybe the boys had been real, had run around the car in normal human fashion, and my panicked mind had filled in impossible details. But late that night, alone in my apartment with every light burning, I found myself researching electromagnetic fields and kinetic energy. diving down rabbit holes of fringe science and theoretical physics. I read about ley lines and energy vortexes, about places where the normal rules seemed negotiable. I studied maps of the Blackstone Reserve, looking for anything that might explain what I'd experienced. What I found was worse than confirmation or debunking would have been. The reserve had been established in 1987 on land that had previously housed a private research facility, something connected to a defense contractor whose name appeared in heavily redacted government documents. The facility had been closed abruptly in 1985 after what the reports termed an industrial accident that had required extensive environmental cleanup. Most of the details were classified, but one document mentioned electromagnetic anomalies in the area, equipment failures that couldn't be explained by conventional physics. There was a reference to subjects and energy displacement experiments, though the context was lost in black marker. I found 3 other reports of strange encounters on that stretch of road, dating back to the early 90s. Hikers who'd seen figures moving too fast to track. A state trooper who'd filed a report about a broken-down motorist who'd vanished while he was calling for a tow truck, leaving only unusual footprints behind. A geology survey team that had detected impossible magnetic readings in the area before their equipment mysteriously failed. The reports all had one thing in common. They'd been filed, investigated briefly, and then quietly archived without resolution. Official explanations ranged from equipment malfunction to witness unreliability, but the pattern was unmistakable. Something was happening in the Blackstone Reserve, something that didn't fit into normal categories of understanding. I haven't been back to that stretch of road, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I find myself thinking about those boys in their expensive gear, about the perfect synchronization of their movement and the absolute confidence in their impossible claims. I think about the pattern of footprints and what kind of intelligence might create such a deliberate design. Were they human? Were they ever alive in any sense I'd recognize? Or were they something else entirely? Echoes of whatever experiments had once taken place in that forest, energy patterns that had somehow learned to mimic human form and behavior. The questions follow me through ordinary days, hiding behind routine tasks and mundane conversations. I catch myself checking voltmeters in parking lots, looking for patterns in the way people move through spaces, listening for that distinctive sound of feet hitting pavement in perfect rhythm, because part of me, the part that refuses to accept rational explanations for irrational experiences, knows they're still out there, still running their impossible circuits, still offering their strange assistance to stranded motorists who stumble into their territory, still charging batteries with pure kinetic impossibility, leaving infinity symbols pressed into the earth like signatures on a contract I never agreed to sign. The worst part isn't the fear or the uncertainty. It's the growing suspicion that what happened to me wasn't random, that I was chosen somehow, selected for reasons I can't begin to understand, that the breakdown wasn't mechanical failure, but an invitation, and by accepting their help, I'd become part of something larger and more alien than I'd ever imagined. The car runs perfectly now, too perfectly. The gas mileage is better than it's ever been. The engine purrs with mechanical contentment that seems almost eager. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if it's really my car anymore, or if it's become something else, a hybrid of metal and impossibility, charged with energy that shouldn't exist. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it humming. A sound like feet on pavement, running in endless circles, keeping time with a heartbeat that might not be entirely human. Story 14. The package arrived on a Tuesday that tasted like copper pennies and old regret. 3 months had passed since I'd walked away from Ravens Hollow Winery, leaving behind the musty cellars and the peculiar incidents that management preferred to dismiss as atmospheric quirks. The severance check had been generous enough to suggest they wanted me gone badly, and I'd been content to let sleeping vintages lie. Until the bottle arrived. No return address. No delivery signature required. Just a familiar burgundy label bearing the Ravens Hollow crest and a vintage date that made my hands tremble as I lifted the package from my doorstep. 1847. The same year as the bottle we'd found in the sealed chamber beneath the main cellar, the one that had started everything. The bottle felt warm against my palms despite the October chill, and something deep in my chest began to flutter like a trapped moth. I carried it inside, setting it carefully on my kitchen counter, where afternoon light filtered through my windows and made the dark glass appear almost translucent. I should have left it unopened. The cork came free with surprising ease, releasing a whisper of air that carried scents I couldn't quite place. Earth and roses and something else. Something that reminded me of the way mirrors smell when you breathe on them. I poured a small measure into a wine glass, watching the liquid catch the light in ways that seemed almost deliberate. The first sip tasted like memory, but it was the second sip that changed everything. As the wine settled on my tongue, images began to flood my vision. Not memories, but scenes playing out in the surface of the liquid itself. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating, but when I looked down into the glass again, the visions were still there. Corridors lined with mirrors stretched endlessly in every direction. The images reflected and re-reflected until they became a maze of infinite regression. The walls seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, and in the silver surfaces, I could see movement. Shadows that didn't belong to anything casting them. Shapes that twisted and writhed just at the edge of perception. This wasn't Raven's Hollow's main cellar. This was something else entirely. Something deeper and older, as if the winery had been built on top of secrets that refused to stay buried. I set the glass down with shaking hands, but the images didn't fade. If anything, they grew clearer, more insistent. I could see archways carved from stone that gleamed like bone, and niches set into the walls between the mirrors. Dozens of them, each one empty except for the last. In that final niche sat a doll, not a child's toy, but something more elaborate. A porcelain figure in a tattered Victorian dress, with glass eyes that seemed to track my movement even through the wine's surface. Around its neck hung a small mirror on a silver chain, and as I watched, transfixed, the doll's mouth opened in what might have been a smile or a scream. I jerked backward, knocking over the glass. Wine spread across my counter in a dark stain, but instead of puddling randomly, the liquid formed letters, each one precise and deliberate. Return her to her place. The words held for perhaps 10 seconds before the wine resumed its natural flow, leaving only the faint outline of the message etched in moisture on my granite counter. I grabbed a dish rag and wiped furiously, but even after the surface was dry, I could swear I still saw the words there, burned into my retinas like afterimages. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, third niche from the left, where the mirrors begin. I deleted the message and blocked the number, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The rational part of my mind, the part that had earned a degree in viticulture and worked in cellars for 15 years, insisted this was some elaborate prank orchestrated by my former colleagues. But the wine had tasted real, and the visions had carried a weight that made my bones ache. That night I dreamed of mirrors. In the dream, I was walking through those endless corridors, my footsteps echoing in ways that suggested vast spaces hidden just beyond what I could see. The mirrors showed not my reflection, but the reflections of people I didn't recognize. Men and women in clothing from different eras, all walking the same path I was walking, all looking as lost and terrified as I felt. I woke to find my bathroom mirror cracked in a perfect spiral, radiating out from a central point at exactly eye level. The crack hadn't been there when I'd brushed my teeth before bed. I was certain of that. The next morning brought another text. The mirrors are hungry. Feed them, or they'll feed on you. I threw the phone across the room, watching it shatter against the wall, but within an hour, my landline rang. No one spoke when I answered, but I could hear something in the background, footsteps on stone, and a sound like wind chimes made of broken glass. The doll was the key. I knew that with the same certainty that told me when grapes were ready for harvest, an instinct honed by years of reading the subtle signs that others missed. Whatever was happening to me, whatever force was reaching across the miles from Raven's Hollow to my suburban home, it wanted that porcelain figure returned to its place. But I'd never seen the doll before. During my time at the winery, I'd explored every accessible part of the cellars, had even helped map the oldest sections for the insurance company. There had been no corridor of mirrors, no niches carved into living stone, yet the images in the wine had felt more real than my own memories. By Thursday, every reflective surface in my house showed that crack, spiral fractures that seemed to spread like infection. My computer screen, the chrome faucets, even the surface of my coffee when the light hit it just right. I stopped looking in mirrors altogether, but I could feel them watching me anyway, their broken gazes following me through my own home. The wine bottle sat empty on my counter, but sometimes I caught glimpses of movement in its dark depths, shadows that shouldn't exist in glass. I wrapped it in towels and shoved it in my closet, but I could still sense its presence like a splinter under my skin. Friday brought rain and a visitor. Mrs. Chen from next door knocked just after noon, her face creased with concern. She mentioned that I'd been muttering to myself while working in my yard, having conversations with someone she couldn't see. When I asked her to describe what she'd heard, her eyes widened. "You kept asking someone to leave you alone," she said quietly. "You kept saying, 'I don't have her, I don't know where she is.' Who were you talking to?" I had no memory of being in my yard, no recollection of any conversation. But when I looked out my kitchen window, I could see the muddy footprints I'd left in my flower bed, a pattern of pacing that spoke of agitation and fear. That night, I made a decision that I knew was either brave or insane. I drove back to Ravens Hollow. The winery sat dark against the October sky, its windows black and empty. My key still worked, another oversight in my hasty departure, and I slipped inside like a thief stealing from my own past. The familiar sense of oak and fermentation wrapped around me, but underneath them lurked something else, the smell of old mirrors and older secrets. I found the entrance purely by accident, or perhaps by design. While searching the main cellar for any sign of the corridor I'd seen in the wine, I stumbled over a loose stone near the eastern wall. When I bent to examine it, my flashlight beam caught something that made my breath catch. The edge of a mirror, partially concealed behind a false wall that had shifted just enough to reveal what lay beyond. The corridor stretched exactly as I'd seen it in my visions, lined with mirrors that reflected my light in dizzying patterns. But these mirrors were wrong somehow, their surfaces rippling like water whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. At the far end, I could see the niches carved into the stone, most of them empty, waiting. The doll sat in the third niche from the left, exactly where the text had indicated. Up close, it was even more unsettling than in my visions. Too lifelike, too aware. Its glass eyes tracked my approach, and the small mirror around its neck swung gently despite the complete absence of any breeze. As I reached for it, every mirror in the corridor began to sing, not with voices, but with harmonics that vibrated through the stone and into my bones. The sound was beautiful and terrible, like the music spheres might make as they ground together in the cosmos. I grabbed the doll and ran, clutching it against my chest as the singing grew louder, more insistent. The mirrors showed me things as I fled, glimpses of people who had walked this path before me, all carrying the same doll, all looking back over their shoulders with the same expression of absolute terror. In one reflection, I saw myself from behind, but the figure in the mirror was wearing clothes I didn't recognize and walking away from me down a corridor that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. I made it back to my car as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold. The doll sat silent in my passenger seat, but I could feel its weight like a physical pressure against my skull. During the drive home, I caught glimpses of it moving in my peripheral vision, small adjustments of posture, tiny shifts in the angle of its head. When I finally worked up the courage to look directly at it, the doll was staring straight ahead, exactly as it had been when I'd placed it in the seat. But the small mirror around its neck now showed not my reflection, but the reflection of someone else entirely, a woman in Victorian dress, her mouth open in a silent scream that matched the expression frozen on the doll's porcelain face. I brought it home because I had no choice. The alternative was leaving it in the car, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it would find its way inside regardless of any precautions I might take. Better to keep it where I could watch it. The cracks in my mirrors began to heal the moment I carried the doll across my threshold. Within hours, every reflective surface in my house had returned to normal, showing only the expected images of my familiar rooms and my own haggard reflection. But the healing came with a price. Now the mirrors showed too much. In my bathroom mirror, I could see not just my face but the corridor behind it, stretching away into impossible distances. My coffee cup reflected not my kitchen, but that same stone chamber, and in every reflection, the doll sat in its niche, watching and waiting. I tried to return it to Ravens Hollow the next morning, but the winery was gone. Where the building had stood for over a century, I found only an empty field overgrown with weeds. No foundation, no ruins, no sign that anything had ever been built there. When I asked at the local historical society, the elderly volunteer looked at me with genuine confusion and insisted that no winery had ever operated in that location. But I still had the doll. It sits now on my mantelpiece, a seemingly innocent porcelain figure in a tattered dress. Visitors compliment its craftsmanship, noting the remarkable detail in its face and the delicate work of its tiny mirror necklace. They never mention the way its eyes seem to follow them around the room, or the soft whispers that sometimes emanate from its direction during the quiet hours before dawn. The mirrors in my house are clean and bright, showing nothing more unusual than my daily routine. But sometimes, when the light hits them just right, I catch glimpses of that corridor stretching away into darkness, and I know that somewhere in those impossible depths, others are walking the same path I walked, carrying their own burdens toward niches that wait to be filled. The wine bottle remains in my closet, wrapped in towels but never quite forgotten. On nights when sleep proves elusive, I can hear it humming softly to itself, a lullaby made of broken glass and reflected light. Sometimes I think about unwrapping it, about pouring one more glass and seeing what new visions might swim up from its depths. But I've learned patience. The doll has taught me that some hungers are best fed slowly, and some mirrors are better left unexamined. After all, I'm no longer certain whether I found the doll, or whether it found me. And in the small mirror around its neck, my reflection continues to scream in perfect eternal silence.